All right, everyone, welcome back to the Deep Truth Symposium, Visionaries Speak Out. This is our second day, and this is our third panel. And we've got a great panel lined up for you. I will just reiterate again, the motivation and inspiration behind this symposium is the fact that at the premier event for left-wing politics and dialogue in New York City, the Left Forum, many of the speakers and subjects that are being presented here in the Deep Truth Symposium were banned this year. And they were also, in many cases, banned last year. So that is the inspiration behind putting this presentation together for you. We all of us who are participating speakers and the people putting it together feel it's very important that you hear this information for yourself, and then you can have a context within which you yourself can judge whether or not this is information that you should not be allowed to hear. Having said that, let's introduce this next panel. It is a powerful subject, apparently one that strikes fear into the heart of some people at the Left Forum, and we're going to be talking about false flags, mass Psy-Op events being used as a pretext for war and a surveillance state. And that is absolutely the case of the times that we live in. We're going to start this panel off. By the way, I should say we're speaking with Ole Dammegard, originally from, I believe, Norway, and now in, is it Denmark?
It's Sweden.
Sweden, sorry. Anyhow, just a powerful truth warrior, in my opinion. Dr. Kevin Barrett, who's been in the trenches on this subject, as well as a few others for many years, and has, in fact, paid a price for it, I think, but is yet undeterred and unbowed. And the great Barbara Honegger, again, one of the happiest warriors I know, extremely well-informed, somebody who's been there, done that, right there at the Pentagon, working within the U.S. government and so forth, and she's got so much to impart. This is going to be a great panel. Let's start off with first Barbara Honegger. Barbara has, like I said, worked in various capacities in the United States government, U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York as well. She's worked in that office.
No, that's not correct. That was the U.S. Department of Justice.
Right. Well, I'm sorry. I'm reading off the bio here. But in any case, as you hear, Barbara will keep us straight to the facts. And worked in the Reagan administration and so forth. Well, in any case, she's become quite the expert on 9/11 and what happened on that day, and can speak with great authority on these subjects. Barbara, welcome to Deep Truth Visionaries Speak Out.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much to Kat and Cheryl and to you, Tom, for this incredible opportunity to reach, I hope, thousands, if not millions of people eventually when we put this up on YouTube or wherever it goes. I would like to say before I get into my slides, and there are going to be a lot of them, I'm going to be speaking very quickly, and I'm not going to be on the screen. The slides will be on the screen in just a moment. But I would just like to point out to people that many of the panels, or the information in the panels that you're going to see, at least in our panel on false flags as pretext for war and a surveillance state, as well as Alison Weir's panel, most of the information, or a lot of it, in what you've already heard from her and will again, I believe, in this online conference. People need to know that originally, 2 years ago, we were accepted. And last year, Alison was accepted. And so what happens is they don't really know what it is they want to censor until they've heard it. And so it's only the second and the third years. This is my third year in either the Left Out Forum or the Left Forum, the official Left Forum, or the Left Out Forum, where I've been speaking. So the official Left Out Forum people, they let you speak usually until they hear what you have to say, and then they censor you the next year or the one after. So let's get to the slides. So Alan, or can someone tell me, is my first slide on the screen? Yes? I'm going to assume the first slide is on the screen, and from now on, you're, I don't believe, going to see me, because I'm going to fill my screen with the slides so that I can go through them very quickly. So the topic that I've decided to talk to you about is 9/11, and I'm going to support this as an American Gladio attack, and I mean that quite literally. So slide 2, I'm dedicating this presentation and everything else that I do from now on to Judge Ferdinando Impazzamato. He was the former Chief Justice of Italy's Supreme Court. He personally prosecuted the Gladio false flag terror attacks in his country of Italy. And he and his investigative magistrates there, they have a slightly different legal system than we do, actually, a very different legal system based upon Napoleonic law. He and his investigative magistrates, when he was there on the Italy Supreme Court, actually uncovered the proof that the explosives that were used to massacre over 80 innocent civilians in the Bologna train station massacre, terrorist attack, actually came from the NATO base there in Italy. So he has actually written 2 books, at least 2, if not 3, on 9/11. They are in Italian, and Jane Clark and myself are working right now to do everything we can to get them translated into English and published for the world to see. This will show you something about what an incredibly courageous and amazing individual Judge Impazzamato was. Unfortunately, he died about a year ago. This is a cover of a magazine in which, if I can roughly translate it, it means the judge of courage, the great courageous judge. This is a photograph of Judge Impazzamato and myself at the Justice in Focus Symposium that started our quest for true 9/11 legal accountability based upon the forensic facts that the 9/11 Truth Movement has already pulled together. So this was a couple of years ago in New York City at Cooper Hall. Unfortunately, Judge Impazzamato died. I'm now on slide 5. This is his state funeral, his state funeral procession in Rome over this past year. He was a greatly, greatly beloved man. He fought the mafia. He won cases for the mafia. His brother was assassinated by the mafia, but that didn't stop him, and he kept going forward. So what is Gladio? Now, I should say that as I understand it, they're in Italian, but I've met with Judge Impazzamato in Rome with members of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry a couple of years ago with Daniel Sheehan and Jane Clark and myself. And we learned there that his 2 books, at least, on 9/11, which are in Italian, are making the case that the 9/11 attacks was actually an American Gladio. And in my presentation, which I gave in Rome when I met Judge Impazzamato the first time, was actually on that topic. And I took it beyond what you're going to see in this presentation. So on the next slide, which is slide 7, what is Gladio? Gladio, in a nutshell, the Cold War false flag terrorist attacks during the Cold War against innocent civilians in Europe by the extreme right of Europe, and that included the Pentagon, the CIA, and NATO, to blame and discredit the left. And what people are going to learn in this amazing presentation on 9/11, this is my hypothesis, but it's a very supported hypothesis, as you'll see, is that 9/11 was literally an American Gladio with many of the same people, if not the same people, who massacred innocent civilians throughout Europe during the Cold War, actually brought their Gladio attacks back to the United States. And the mother of all of those is 9/11. So what you're going to learn here, and this is my own research, I've put these dots together and gave this presentation first to Judge Impazzamato and others in Rome 2 to 3 years ago, is that the man who is the spider in the center of the web for what we're going to learn here was General Lyman Lemnitzer. So just a couple of more data points. There was the Bologna bombing I mentioned that Judge Impazzamato personally investigated in Rome and got the proof that the Bologna bombings that killed over 80 innocent civilians to blame on the communists and the socialists and anybody they didn't want to win an upcoming election in Italy to discredit them. The Bologna bombing, Judge Impazzamato and his investigative magistrates got the proof. They have the documents, actually, that the explosives that killed all those innocent civilians were from one of the NATO bases, the big NATO base in Italy. There were also the Red Brigade's attacks in Germany. We now know from some books that you're going to see the covers of here in a moment that the Gladio operators, NATO, CIA, Pentagon, also I'm sure MI6 from Britain intelligence, they infiltrated the Red Brigades they had their infiltrators and their informants in there who were actually responsible for doing the agent provocateur actions to provide the explosives for the so-called left to blow up innocent civilians. Then there was the assassination of President Aldo Moro, which Judge Imposamoto personally investigated on the Supreme Court of Italy. And this will be near and dear to Ollie Dammegard's presentation, probably. The assassination of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, which is like the assassination of John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy here in our country. And that's another example of a Gladio operation. So now I'm going to the next slide, which is slide number 8. This is just the cover, part of the cover. I'm pretty technophobic, so I wasn't able to get the whole cover in my slide, my PowerPoint slide. But this is a cover of a book, The Pentagon's Nazi Mafia, Gladio, NATO's Dagger in the Heart of Europe by Cottrell. It's just one of many books since the Cold War is over that proves what we're telling you about the Gladio false flag operations by the CIA, Pentagon, and NATO in Europe throughout the Cold War. This is probably the most important book by Professor Daniel Genzer, who is in Switzerland. It's NATO's Secret Armies, and everyone in the world really needs to read this book. This is no longer speculative, these are facts. The next slide is slide number 10. This is just an example of how anyone, in this particular example, Professor Daniel Genzer, he not only looked at, for his in-depth study, proving the Gladio attacks by the Western radical right-wing powers against the so-called left in Europe to discredit them throughout the Cold War, but he is also a major truth teller on 9/11. And this is a screen from the beginning of his presentation for the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. The next slide, slide number 11. This is just one example, and people can ask me in the Q's and A's, but we know for a fact, and I personally know for a fact, and know this individual personally, his name is Colonel Oswald Lewinter, and I believe that's U.S. Army Colonel. He also claimed that he had a position in the German Army and German intelligence, and he made a lot of claims. But anyway, he's now deceased, I believe. But this man, you're looking at a screen capture from the segment in the BBC special documentary on Operation Gladio, called Operation Gladio, that you can see online on YouTube. And this man comes on at the screen at this time, and you can hear him talk about how he was the CIA's liaison to Gladio. And believe me, there was, and I'm certain still is, probably under a different name, a so-called Gladio liaison office in the Pentagon and also in the CIA to this day. This is a man who, by the way, was I didn't know it at the time until later, because this documentary came out after my book October Surprise was published on the deep story behind Iran Gate. We're getting to that in the next slide, I believe. But this man was one of the 3 then anonymous witnesses or sources for my book October Surprise. If you read my book October Surprise, he is informant Y. This is the cover of my book October Surprise. And for anyone who would like to get it, it's still available on Amazon. I think you can buy it for 35 cents now. It was published in 1992 or 93, I believe. So please get this book, and there is a section all throughout the book. It's about Informant Y, and the link to the October Surprise in Iran-Contra, believe it or not, and my source for that was the man you just saw, Colonel Oswald Lewinter, CIA's liaison to the Gladio false flag terrorist attacks in Europe throughout the Cold War. The link is that he was my source, and there's a whole chapter in this book, October Surprise, by me, on his information that I supported with other sources, that the then secret Gladio stay-behind stores throughout Europe were actually drawn down and raided to send to Iran during the 1980 Reagan-Bush campaign as the so-called bona fide arms shipments that cemented the treasonous October Surprise deal between the Reagan-Bush senior presidential campaign in 1980 and the Khomeini regime to delay the release of our 52 hostages, ensuring Carter's defeat in exchange for a minimum of $5 billion of arms that then flowed to the Khomeini regime against the law right after Reagan and Bush gained office. That is my book, October Surprise, and it's directly linked to the Gladio stay-behind stores in Europe. The next slide, slide 13. So, knowing this, Could the NATO, Pentagon, CIA black operations teams that we know, it's been proven, mass murdered innocent European civilians throughout Europe, not just in Italy, Germany, but other countries, throughout the Cold War, possibly have perpetrated the same thing here in the United States? Could they have brought their CIA, Pentagon, NATO black operations back home? Yes, they could have. And we know they did. This next slide, which is slide 14, Operation Northwoods document. Many people who are watching this presentation know about this already. This was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when this was signed in March 1962, when President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, was still alive. This document, as many people know, I'm only going to be able to give you a thumbnail sketch, but what this document does is it was actually approved by every single member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not just by General Lemnitzer, who was the chairman. That is, it was signed off on. It was originally, you can see, top secret, no longer is. It's out in the public domain. So what did it do? This document that was approved by every single top officer of all of our 4 military services in the United States in 1962, shortly before President Kennedy was assassinated, what did it do? It approved of terrorist attacks on innocent American civilians, using an airliner with so-called carefully selected CIA passengers, swapping that plane for a remote-controlled plane that was mocked up to look like the original civilian airliner that would then be blown up with an onboard bomb to frame Castro's Cuba to justify an invasion of Cuba. And as you're going to see, this is one of the 2 major templates, or 3 major templates for what actually happened in the United States on 9/11's template for the actual 9/11 attacks. Next slide, 16. So what about what happened on 9/11? What about clearing the skies of all civilian airliners? The next slide, slide 17. Slide 17, this is the cover of the book by the co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission, Keene and Hamilton. It's called Without Precedent. When you read the book, what do they mean by without precedent? What they refer to, amongst other things, but very clearly and explicitly in the book, is that never before, they claim, it's a total and complete big lie, never before 9/11 were all of the civilian planes completely cleared from the skies over the United States of America. That is a lie. It happened in 1962, on October 12th of 1962. You're about to see this. It was the brainchild and masterminded by the same man, General Lyman Lemnitzer. It was called Sky Shield 2. It is one of the templates and precedent for 9/11 on September 11th, 2001 in the United States. The next slide is slide 19. He commanded and organized and oversaw Sky Shield 2. It was October 1961, not 62. It was executed on October 12, 1961, which, by the way, happens to be the birthday of the U.S. Navy. That was only 6 months before the same man, General Lyman Lemnitzer, signed that Northwoods document plan that he tried to get President Kennedy to approve to massacre innocent American civilians, to blame it on Cuba as a pretext for invading Cuba. Kennedy said no, and Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were furious, and we now know that they were definitely complicit in the assassination of President Kennedy not long afterwards. So the twin templates of the 9/11 plot, as you'll see, were developed by the same individual who also, General Lyman Lemnitzer, believe it or not, after he proposed this plan, this Sky Shield 2 plan, to President Kennedy. President Kennedy fired him, but promoted him up, and he headed NATO, and he went on to create the Gladio operations in NATO. So Sky Shield 2, what did it do? This is on October 12th of 1961. It was overseen by NORAD and the Air Force. It cleared the skies over the entire United States mainland of all non-military planes. Now, in this case, a little different than 9/11, the skies were cleared on October 12th, 1961. However, the American public was alerted that it was going to be an exercise, a so-called counter-Soviet Union attack coming over the North Pole, over Canada. And so if you go back in the microfiche, which I've done that. And by the way, I'm the source for alerting Barry Zwicker to this, which is in his book on the media cover-up of 9/11 and media complicity in 9/11. So the United States citizens and United States Congress were alerted in advance, and it was on the front page of the New York Times. You can read this in the microfiche. So it cleared the skies over the entire United States mainland of all non-military planes on the day of the exercise, October 12, 1961. Canadian planes in that exercise played the attackers, the pretend Soviet attackers, and Pentagon planes played the blue team defenders, the Pentagon fighter jets. NORAD radar screens, you read this in the cover stories of the New York Times on this the day before. NORAD radar screens were tagged, they tagged the exercise plane blips that were inserted on the radar screens with a little icon, FK, for a fake plane. And what's the source for this? Believe it or not, besides the New York Times microfiches from those very days before, during, and a few days after Sky Shield 2, in October of 1961, is the Air Force's own publication on September 11th attacks. It's called Air War Over America. I highly recommend it to everyone. The next slide, slide 21. Now, people need to know this if you don't already. On 9/11, what are the parallels to what you've already seen? The Pentagon and NORAD, the same agency that did Sky Shield 2 in 1961, shortly before President Kennedy was assassinated, the Pentagon and NORAD conducted hijack scenario exercises on the morning of 9/11. They were scheduled to begin, depending upon the agency, just before or just after the actual attacks that were piggybacked on similar or even identical scenarios as the so-called exercises. And believe it or not, General Eberhardt testified to the 9/11 Commission. You can still see this at the 9/11 Commission, the National Archives website, the video of his testimony. The head of NATO, and not NATO, the head of NORAD on 9/11, General Ralph Eberhard, actually referred to them as a, quote, Soviet-era exercise. Well, excuse me, the Soviet Union kind of ended back in 1981, didn't it? So why is it a Soviet-era exercise? It was a Soviet-era exercise because they took the Gladio operation and Sky Shield 2 off the shelf, dusted it off, and that's what was behind the planning for the 9/11 attacks here in the United States. On 9/11, radar screens also had exercise plane, FK plane injects. The U.S. skies, of course, in this case, after the actual plane impacts, were cleared of all civilian airliners. But this was, believe me, not without precedent. It had been practiced many times by NORAD and our Department of Defense and CIA and our whole Black Ops intelligence apparatus. The World Trade Center 2 plane was not a civilian airliner. We'll be getting into that. I'm not sure why I added. Oh, I do know why I added that. I added that because we know that for a fact, and we know that for a fact at the Pentagon already as well. I'll be getting into that here in a moment. But the whole point of that is in the Operation Northwoods plan signed off on by the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by General Lemonster, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That plan, of course, was for a civilian airliner to leave an airport and then be swapped for a military plane or a CIA plane that was mocked up to appear like the original civilian airliner that would then be destroyed. The Pentagon attack, bottom line, as you'll see, that is my expertise. It was a self-attack. The Pentagon attacked itself using a remote-controlled plane mocked up to appear to be an American airliner that was destroyed by remote control. And I believe that we're going to be able to prove, I do that in my Behind the Smoke Curtain YouTube on the Pentagon attack. I believe that we can prove that remote-controlled plane that was swapped for the plane that left Dulles Airport, that is alleged to have then made it to the Pentagon, which didn't, was actually one of the special planes of the number 3 or number 4 man under Donald Rumsfeld at the Pentagon, Dov Zakheim. That was his business on the side. All right, this is just slide 22. This is the cover of my my DVD, Behind the Smoke Curtain, and it is on YouTube. It has over 500,000 views. Please do watch it because I'm not able to get into all of the evidence here. Next, now that we've seen that Pentagon, CIA, NATO, Black Ops mass murdered European civilians and authorized it here in the United States, the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, what is the evidence also that this is the real story of 9/11? And next slide, what is that real story? The FBI Strategic Intelligence Operations Center, this will give you a good hint, filled to capacity on 9/11. This is a quote from then Director of the FBI, Robert Mueller. This is the cover of Time magazine, May 10th, 2011. On 9/11, the FBI's Operations Center filled to capacity through, and this is still part of his quote in Time magazine, Pent bomb, P-E-N-T-T-B-O-M. That's short for bomb, B-O-M-B. This is still his quote. The FBI's cryptonym for Pentagon, Twin Towers, and bombing. That's bombing. Not planes, not fires, not hijackers, but bombing. Pre-placed explosives. This is a slide. This is slide number 22, just showing you that the Oklahoma City Federal Building and the Pentagon, after the explosions, the FBI's cryptonyms or abbreviations for their investigations of so-called terrorist attacks that are actually inside jobs, like 9/11 was, and the Gladio operations in Europe were, to be blamed on somebody else. In the case of 9/11, Muslims, so-called radical Muslims who didn't do it. They probably had a plot to do it, but the plot was hijacked and done by our own inside Gladio black operators. This is an example at the top. The Oklahoma City FBI investigation, codename is Oak Bomb. We already know, and the official story of the FBI and everybody else in the government is that it was a bomb, a place bomb. Of course, the bomb in the Ryder truck is not what did this, but that's another story. And down below, Pent bomb. The FBI and everybody who did 9/11, the inside jobbers, they know what they did. And they actually have told you that they know what they did. That's why they've called it Pent bomb. The next slide. I'm not going to be able to get into all of this, and maybe in the Q's and A's I can do more. And by the way, for anyone, I have a lot of slides. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. Anyone who would want my slides, and I will be getting them to Tom Kiely and Kat McGuire and Cheryl Curtis and Ellen Reese, and anybody, and myself, of course. Anyone who wants these slides to see all of them, they tell the story. You don't really need to have me doing the voiceover for all of them to see what the evidence is. I will be happy. I will send my the links to these. I will get them up on the internet, and you'll be able to see all of the slides. And I'll also be happy to send you my PowerPoint slides. So this is a slide number 27, where I'm visually showing you that there's the Pentagon with a Photoshop of the Twin Towers within it. That's to graphically represent what you're now going to see at least part of, and that is the parallels between the real story of what happened at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Of course, they were the same Gladio black operators behind both, as well as Pennsylvania and the anthrax letter attacks, of course. I don't know why that slide is there. We're going to go beyond it. And the next one, I'm now at slide 30. So the real story of 9/11 at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, which are the two major places of the attacks of 9/11, are pre-placed explosives and or incendiaries in both the World Trade Center towers, World Trade Center 1 and 2, and World Trade Center 7, not hit by a plane at all, as well as the Pentagon. And when you see this evidence, you will understand that no foreign terrorist, whether it's Al-Qaeda or 19 hijackers or bin Laden, who is dying in a cave in Afghanistan, or ISIS, morphed later out of Al-Qaeda, that was actually created by Western intelligence, people like the Gladio operators, the no foreign terrorists could possibly have ever had the access to plant the massive numbers of pre-placed explosives, not only in World Trade Center Towers 1, 2, and 7 in New York City, but also in the Pentagon, as you're going to see. This is, now I'm giving you the parallel between the Pentagon attack and the World Trade Center. The main story at both places are pre-placed, the Pentagon is pre-placed explosives. This is a slide number 31, that shows you the difference in time between the first official seismic signal massive event in the deep basements of both World Trade Centers 1 and 2 in New York City before a plane hit either tower, dozens and dozens and dozens of stories higher in the sky. Now, any kindergartner knows that if a massive explosion goes off in the deep basement, and by the way, they also went up a huge pressure wave, came up from the deep basement into the lobby, and that is the reason for the destruction and deaths in the lobby, including for Bob McIlvaine's son on 9/11. And Bob McIlvaine knows that about his son, by the way. We've talked about it. And you're going to see Bob McIlvaine. Actually, I'm going to, well, we won't go back in the slides. All right, so what's the bottom line of this slide? 14 seconds before a plane hit in the floors of the 90s, just below the top in World Trade Center 1, the very first attack of 9/11 was a massive deep basement explosion 14 seconds before that plane hit. And about 16 minutes later, 16 minutes later, at World Trade Center 2 in New York City, the other of the Twin Towers, 17 seconds before a plane hit in the 70s of the floors, way high in the sky, 17 seconds before the plane hit, a massive deep basement explosion went off in the basement of World Trade Center 2. These are facts. So let's look at the Pentagon. Could the same thing have happened at the Pentagon? Is it possible that there was a massive explosion in the Pentagon way before, in this case, not just a few seconds before, but almost 8 minutes before? The official story says the plane was even anywhere close to Washington, D.C. The official story says that a plane, allegedly Flight 77, we can prove that is not the case. There was a plane swap at the Pentagon of the plane that left Dulles Airport. It was swapped out, and the plane that flew back east wasn't even the same one that left Dulles. Therefore, it couldn't have had hijackers on it, even if hijackers had originally gotten on the plane, and there's no public domain proof of that even. However, the official story says that whatever plane approached the Pentagon and did its deed there didn't even happen until 9:37 and 46 seconds, almost 9:38. However, it is a fact that at 9:30, almost 8 minutes before this, there was a massive explosion that went off inside the outside ring of the west wedge of the Pentagon, near April Gallup's office. She's a critical witness. I call her the Willie Rodriguez of the Pentagon. And you could think of Willie Rodriguez as the April Gallup of the World Trade Center. She's an incredible, courageous witness of the Pentagon attack. Her office, if you look at this slide, which is slide 33, you will see that her office is, if you see that line that divides the two wedges, and you're looking at the west side of the Pentagon, a graphic of it, her office was to the left or to the north of that dividing line between the two wedges. But to the right, you see that white arrow space. That's the alleged official story, the alleged so-called alleged flight penetration path of Flight 77. It doesn't even get anywhere close into Wedge 2. And her office was in Wedge 2 in the outer ring, 120 to 150 feet further to the left or north than the alleged impact point of a plane almost 8 minutes later. There were a massive number of people who died. She luckily did not die on 9/11. And I've moved forward to slide 35. Slide 35 is April Gallup on the lawn afterwards. Her wristwatch was stopped by this massive explosion by her desk in the Army, Secretary of the Army's area at 9:30 on 9/11. She still has that wristwatch, and it still has the explosive dust on it to be analyzed. The internal timeline of the White House itself, which I was provided by Professor David Ray Griffin, it is now in the public domain. He got it from the National Archives, now released to the public. It shows that, now this is the internally compiled White House timeline of 9/11. It also comports with April Gallup's stopped wristwatch that the attack at the Pentagon was 9:30, not the official story time of almost 9:38. Over the skies of Washington, D.C. on 9/11, before the real first attack at the Pentagon by pre-placed inside explosions at 9:30, this E-4B, flying Pentagon doomsday machine with state-of-the-art surveillance and command and control that can see everything for hundreds of miles, let alone directly over the Pentagon, and it was very close to it, was circling over Washington before the Pentagon attack. They know exactly what happened there. They were probably controlling it from the plane. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, he became Secretary of Defense, of course, later, confirmed on ABC News, especially with Diane Sawyer, it's still on YouTube, that it was in fact the doomsday plane, the flying Pentagon, flying over DC and the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11 before April Gallup's wristwatch was stopped by the massive explosion inside the Pentagon almost 8 minutes before any plane was anywhere close to Washington, D.C. I'm going to move through these next slides. They simply prove that all of the official reactions in Washington, D.C., as well as finally removing Bush from the Florida classroom, happened in response to that massive explosion inside the Pentagon at 9:30, because all of this happened right afterwards. Everything happened right afterwards. And you need to get my slides to be able to read this. Even in New York City, where 2 attacks had already happened in the World Trade Center and not even yet caused the New York Stock Exchange to shut down. It was finally urgently shut down at 9:32 because of the real first attack on the Pentagon, which was by April Gallup's desk at 9:30. I'm going to move through these slides. Proof that there was pre-placed explosives at the Pentagon. This is slide number 43. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff himself, who used Shelton in his book in his memoirs called Without Hesitation, page 434. When he got to the Pentagon shortly after the attacks, the smell of cordite, which is like a plastique explosive. It's a cool burning plastique explosive. It was probably what was used, and we could prove that by doing an analysis of the explosive material still on April Gallup's shoe that she has saved, and her wristwatch, and her clothing that she has in a safe deposit box.
Barbara, speaking of wristwatches, unfortunately, the tyranny of time is stepping in here.
How many minutes? Can I have 2 minutes?
Well, you're already over by about 2 minutes now. Okay. And I'm afraid we're going to get backed up, but we can absolutely circle back to you during the Q&A if you'd like to finish up.
Give me one more minute, because
one more minute. Well, take 1.5.
1.5. Wow, thank you so much. Okay, so bottom line is there were bombs going off or explosives going off inside the Pentagon. I've interviewed people, hundreds of people saying bombs, bombs, bombs. It's a bomb. It's a bomb. Also, it sounded like a series of explosions going off, sounded like a series of bombs exploding. This is from somebody inside the Pentagon, 2 rings in, inside the Pentagon on 9/11. It sounds identical to that famous clip from the Nade brothers video of the World Trade Center attacks, where that firefighter said it went boom, 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 like when you're bringing a building down. And that's exactly what was going on inside the Pentagon. So I'm going to move forward now. If we can do this, I'll let you know. Okay, I'm now on slide 67. If Alan could bring that one up. If not, I'll just tell you verbally. The cockpit voice recorder, you can see it on the screen, slide 67 if it's there. The cockpit voice recorder at the Pentagon that was made public. It wasn't even the right kind of cockpit voice recorder for any American Airlines 757 on 9/11. And we know that from American Airlines' own press release that was put out by American Airlines right after this was put out in public. It was the wrong kind. And therefore, the flight data recorder that the Pentagon and the FBI and the government rests its entire case, along with the radar records, which were also doctored. I can prove that and do so in Behind the Smoke Curtain. That the flight data recorder data is from a mocked-up flight data recorder that was done on, it's called a bench. It was created on a bench. It's digitally created in order to make it look like what they want you to believe happened with the plane at the Pentagon. It was the wrong kind.
Well, Barbara, I don't have a gavel, but I need to speak from the bench now.
Very good.
And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
For your ever-improving presentation. I must tell you, it just keeps getting better and better, more and more streamlined.
So people, bottom line, one more sentence. People need to know that the real story at the Pentagon and the World Trade Center is the same by the same inside Black Ops Gladio operators. It was an inside job, and the real perpetrators are still at large, and they must be brought to justice. Thank you.
Very well, and we'll return to Barbara and the other speakers during the Q&A. And Barbara, you can get a chance to go over some more points if you'd like at that point time. Now, J. Michael Springmann is our next speaker. He cannot be with us today, unfortunately, due to scheduling issues, but he has provided us with a videotape. Michael Springmann is an attorney, an author, political commentator, and he's a former diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service, where he worked in places like Saudi Arabia and got a chance to see firsthand the kind of rules that were being broken to give certain people visas to get into the United States that should never have been allowed, and how higher-ups forced that to happen over the objections of inline workers in the State Department. Visas for Al-Qaeda, CIA handouts that rock the world is his current book. Goodbye Europe, Hello Chaos, Merkel's Migrant Bomb is another one of his works. Let's listen now to Michael Springmann.
Hi, I'm Mike Springmann. I'm here to talk to you about the weaponization of migrants in Europe and causes and effects. I think that we've got weaponized migration. You can read about it in more detail in my book, Goodbye Europe, Hello Chaos, Merkel's Migrant Bomb. You've got 250 pages. You can get it from Amazon as either a paperback book or as a ebook. You can also go to my website, www.michaelspringmann.com, and read reviews of the book and browse around in it, see what people are saying about it. So that said, I'll try and confine my remarks to my allotted half an hour. If I don't, I'll get the hook and I'll never come back and talk to you folks again. I'm pleased to be here. And I've got to tell you that weaponized migration and the idea of the deep state and the empire reaching out to strangle democracy here, there, and everywhere is not a new concept. They practiced on it at the Boston Marathon in April of 2013. That's 5 years ago. We had the sticky fingers of the intelligence services deeply involved in this. Graham Fuller, who had run the terrorist campaign in the old Soviet Union during the Afghan war, when the Americans and the CIA and the Saudis and inter-services intelligence of Pakistan were recruiting the Mujahideen terrorists from Saudi Arabia and from 52 locations in the United States, including Washington, D.C. They were running them across the Amur River into the old Soviet Union, trying to stir up revolution and rioting and disruption in the Muslim republics. Graham Fuller was running this. And Graham Fuller's daughter, surprise, surprise, was once married to Ruslan Tsarnaev, who was the uncle of the two people charged with the Boston Marathon bombing. Now, the thing of it was, these people were all tied to the extremist groups that are now being funneled into Europe. But the practice deal in Boston was you had warrantless searches, people confined to their homes, police and soldiers in the streets, and there was no real abolition of the Constitution, except that it was simply dismissed and ignored. This has happened fairly recently in Europe. A few years ago in France, in 2015, just 3 years ago, in November 13th, we had unknown people of unknown origins using AK-47s and plastic explosives to attack concert halls, restaurants, sports stadium, and other locations. Now, this is in France, where weapons and explosives are extremely tightly controlled, but somehow the AK-47s came from the Balkans, came from the old Yugoslav army stores, and were likely smuggled by people who have been involved with the Central Intelligence Agency in the past, where they helped bring down Yugoslavia. And the French were absolutely horrified. The shockwave ran across the country. Again, you had dragnets, warrantless searches. You had people in their houses afraid to come out. No one knew what was really happening. And suddenly there were soldiers on the streets, and 5,000 police were recruited to take care of the situation, bring it under control. Just a few more days later, in Germany, November 17th, it was a similar situation, but without the bloodshed. There was an alleged attack ready to be perpetrated on a sports stadium in Hanover. And according to a woman I know in Germany who was sending me real-time email messages, there was no information, there was no hard facts, there was just this fear of something going to happen, and nobody knew what. And again, the entire country panicked. The people were afraid of packages, of suitcases on railroad station platforms. And my friend told me that the sound of police sirens was a constant background to city noise. And a few more days later, on the 21st of November in Brussels, again, there was no real bloody attack, but there was an imminent threat. People were told to stay home, stay in their houses, don't go out. They shut down the subway, which is very extensive in Brussels. They shut down concert halls, closed restaurants, and people were afraid to come out. The streets were filled again with soldiers and police, and people were ready to do anything for their security. And sure enough, something was done. The French Air Force attacked Syria. The French Navy sent its nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, Charles de Gaulle, to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea to bomb Syria and Iraq. Then the British entered the fray, sending more warplanes in to bomb Syria. The Germans joined in non-violently by sending a couple of extra frigates to the region and sending more soldiers to Mali and to Iraq. Now, this was 5 years ago, 2013, and just a couple of years later, you had the wave of migration start. You had people essentially invited into Europe from the American wars in South Asia, Southwest Asia, and North Africa. And these were people that were driven out of their homes by the American, by the French, by the Israeli bombardment. Their houses were destroyed, their factories were wrecked, there was no place to work, banks were closed, lack of food, nobody had any money. So instead of taking and putting an end to the wars in the region, as the Germans should have urged, as the British should have urged, as the French should have urged, as the rest of Europe should have urged, you had the Americans continuing with the wars and in lockstep with the Israelis and with the French and the British to destroy these countries and drive the people out, herd them, really. I mean, this is offensive to Muslims. They don't want to be herded like animals, but they were. They were guided by smugglers. They were guided by intelligence services. They were guided by the big American company Cisco. They were guided by George Soros and his organizations such as the Open Society and his Central European University in Budapest. And they were moved with Wi-Fi. They were moved with cell phones. You could get on your cell phone and find where the nearest trafficker was. You could find out the cost of a smuggler to whichever country you wanted to by road, rail, or air. And you had more than 1 million people in a few short months driven and carefully guided into the benefit-rich countries of Europe. And these were generally not workmen. They were not doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs, or the equivalent thereof. They were essentially young single males under the age of 35, a few women, and a lot of unaccompanied children. Hidden in this were also terrorists that the Americans had carefully recruited with the aid of the Saudis and the Pakistanis in years past. You had the Arab-Afghan Legion, essentially, the people that had been recruited by the Mujahideen. And they were the people who had trained others in the great art of shooting things down and blowing things up. And they went into Europe. And they created uproar. The people in Germany, for example, didn't like this. They said, this is our country. We get to say who comes in and get to say who stays out. But there were other groups in Germany who wanted to welcome them with open arms and flowers and candy. And this was a pattern and a practice that had been written out and carefully researched and presented as, I assume, a cookbook for how to overthrow governments and destabilize countries by Kelly Greenhill. Her book was Weapons of Mass Migration, and it appeared about 2010. And in this book, she talked about coercion costs. Well, you weaken a country by coercing the population to leave. There are no people there to work. There are no people to run the banks. There are no people to direct the factories. There are no doctors or lawyers or whatever. And you weaken the host country that receives this wave of migrants because they have to absorb them. And in most instances, you don't have a pool of ready-made Pashtun speakers or Arabic speakers or any other language that is not normally current in Europe or other countries in North and South America, for example. And you've got tension, you've got conflict, you've got budgetary issues. In Munich, for example, they had 50,000 of these refugees who were more economic refugees, I think, than real, honest-to-God asylum seekers. They had no place to sleep except on the cold ground of sports stadia. There weren't even 50,000 air mattresses in the city, as one city councilman had remarked. So you've got this tremendous conflict. You've got this tremendous wave of migrants as a result of these wars, and it's been carefully rehearsed a couple of years previously to show that a wave of Arab and Muslim migrants does nothing but stir up trouble in a country. And this has continued to the present day. You've got Germany, for example, again, the architect of this, along with Mark Rutte, the former Dutch, or the present Dutch, Prime Minister, Gerald Knaus, who is head of a think tank in Austria, who is one of George Soros' Open Society members. And you had a Diederik Samson, who was a Dutch politician. They created and sold to Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, the prime minister, the idea of bringing in hundreds of thousands of migrants a year. This would help the European countries with their low birth rates have new people paying into their social security system, have new people to boost their birth rates, and they would work cheaply. Just like in the United States, with the Americans destroying Central and South America through revolutions, coup d'etat, fomented wars either directly or indirectly. Look at Guatemala, look at Nicaragua, you name it, there has been a revolution or a overthrow of a government there backed by the United States and its intelligence services and its armed forces. So the Americans are wondering where all these people came from, why everybody in the United States doesn't speak English anymore, and why they've got all these people working for nothing. Well, it's because their countries have been destroyed by the American government, and they've driven these people into the United States to work cheaply and vote for the Democratic Party. So you've got the same thing happening in Europe. You've got a carefully honed propaganda. It's been worked out for years in the United States, and it's being worked out in Europe now at the present. They say, well, these people are leaving their destroyed countries. They want a place to live. They want a place to work. They want to contribute to society. Well, this is good on the surface. And indeed, some of these people have come there and done very well for themselves, but they were well educated to begin with. They had a lot of money and a lot of connections. There was a Syrian eye doctor who spent something like 13,000 or 15,000 euros to travel from Syria to Turkey to Southeast Asia and back to Germany, where he had relatives. And he's done very well. But a lot of these people are not the kind of people that you need in Europe. Europe is no longer a country where you have steel mills, where you need strong backs and weak minds to shovel coal, to shovel coke, to shovel or pour molten metal. You've got high-tech industries like in Germany, the Carl Zeiss people created a mirror for the space program that if it were the size of Lake Constance, maybe 100 miles east to west, there wouldn't be a couple millimeters difference in the surface area from the high point to the low point in all that expanse. And you need people to do that. You need experts in computers. You need experts in high technology and in avionics and all sorts of electronics. And instead of taking the money that's going to NATO, instead of taking the money that's going to the American wars in the Middle East and elsewhere, and building refugee camps for all these migrants who've been driven out of their homes through their destroyed countries, and setting up temporary shelters, setting up temporary schools to educate them, to teach them something useful if they don't have the skills needed elsewhere, the Americans and the Europeans simply went on with their wars. They went on and said that, we have these migrants, we have to help them, we have to spend money on them. And according to the one German economist estimate, it's $1 trillion to pay for the result of teaching all these people the languages, to force them to give up their own culture, their own tongue, their own religion, and join into Europe and become something other than Afghans or Syrians or Libyans. So this is, in a way, the migrants are victims in all of this. These are the people who have had their countries destroyed and are being forced out and being forced into an alien culture and being forced to give up their past that in some instances, like in Iraq or Afghanistan or Iran, goes back 5,000 years. It was the Iraqis who invented the wheel and the responsible, accountable government. So it's beyond belief why this wasn't done, except that it benefits the countries with cheap labor to begin with, but it causes the destruction of Europe in the long run, because the Americans see that this huge wave of migrants, instead of being having their countries rebuilt with the war machine's money, they're being herded into Europe and told to sit there, and they will get better and better as time goes by. But what happens is you have tensions between the migrants, you have tensions between the migrants and the natives, And you have vast sums of money spent trying to get these people to fit in and teach them German or Italian or Norwegian or whatever language you want, and try and teach them about language and culture. And you don't rape 10-year-old boys at a swimming pool if you have a sudden sex attack, as happened in Vienna with an Iraqi refugee. So you've got a mixture of people who don't know the culture, a mixture of people who are in some ways terrorists because they've been carefully slipped into this mass of people who have thrown away their passports and who don't necessarily register with the local offices when they turn up in a country. And you've got Angela Merkel responsible for the whole thing based on her advice from the Dutch and from the Austrian think tank. And you've got people who see the idea, well, let's make Europe more multicultural. We don't need a solid German base. We don't need a solid Italian base anymore. Let's bring in different people with different religions and different skin colors and different backgrounds. And that way we can have one happy society. And in fact, it's not happening. What it's doing is weakening Europe, because Europe is seen as a major competitor for the United States. And the United States deathly fears the union of German technology with Russian natural resources. And this is what President Putin has been trying to do. He's been trying to make overtures to Germany and the rest of Europe to combine results to make a strong European Europe, as Charles de Gaulle once wanted, instead of an American Europe, as the American government wants. And President Putin, in fact, has said repeatedly that the problem with Europe, the problem with this mass migration, is another example of failed American foreign policy. And this is the issue that we have to address, and no one wants to look at the problem. In Germany, for example, despite riots, despite rapes, despite this huge disaster on New Year's Eve just a couple of years ago, where people all over the country, women especially, were groped, robbed, and in some cases raped and stripped of their clothes, nobody wants to talk about this. The police didn't turn out their water cannon on the thousands of migrants rioting in Cologne, for example, but they turned them out a week later when they had a right-wing party, Pegida, demonstrating against the migrant wave. They used the water cannon on them in the middle of the cold January. So what happens in Germany is that anyone who criticizes this, who goes online to Facebook, who says in print that we've got to do something about the migrants, that if they rape another woman, let's burn another migrant shelter, they're arrested, they're fined. In some instances, they go to jail for saying that Merkel and her ministers should be set up against the wall and shot. So you've got the news media cooperating with the German government and other governments talking about this and then minimizing the problems, minimizing the disasters, and minimizing the failure of the governments to listen to their people and look out for the best interests of their own people and for the migrants who are, again, as I have mentioned repeatedly in this comment, have been taken away from their own countries destroyed, and they're forced to give up their own ways of living to absorb an alien way of life. But unfortunately, nobody wants to talk about this. Nobody wants to think about this. And if you do, you're denounced as racist, neo-Nazi, right-wing extremist. This was done in Germany. The Alternative for Germany party, for example, was running hard against Merkel and her Christian Democratic Union, and they clobbered them. Merkel and her CDU hung on to power, as did the Socialist Party, but they were badly beaten. They've never had such results in a election since the end of the war, since Germany was recreated as a sovereign state. The AfD, the Alternative for Germany, racked up 13% of the vote thereabouts, close to 20% in the old East Germany, because they didn't like what was happening to Germany. And to some extent, they were seen as disgruntled CDU members, and other people seem to think that it had been taken over by extremist organizations and trying to push them to take alien viewpoints to make them look more dangerous than they really were. But the same thing happened in France. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front, the Front National, she got about a third of the French vote, despite heavy campaigning, denouncing her as a racist and extremist and a neo-Nazi like her father. and Emmanuel Macron, the eventual winner in the presidential contest, he had one previous post in government, that of economics minister, and he was the guy who caused riots all across France by trying to strip labor of its benefits, and that they gained by hard-won action over the years. He's doing the same thing now as president. So people are disgruntled with this. People are mad as hell and want a change. Same thing is happening in Italy. I initially thought that in Italy, the right wing was going to do better than it has in the past. But in the last set of elections, they've done very well. They, in fact, have created a crisis for the establishment by creating a union of opposition groups to the status quo. And the president, Mattarella, is under attack from left, right, and center because he dismissed the coalition because they wanted someone in he didn't like. And that is not democracy. That essentially is dictatorship. And the Italians are making this guy pay the price. And it's only a couple of weeks, I guess, or maybe a month or so until we see what final results from this. But everywhere across Europe, for example, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders was again denounced as a racist, anti-Semitic, anti-alien, whatever, because he commented about the number of Moroccans coming into the Netherlands on the floor of Parliament. He was chastised for that. He was sued by the government for speaking his mind in a democratic society, in a democratic parliament. And as a result, Mark Rutte had to switch a little bit more to the right, but still he lost votes. And Geert Wilders now has the second largest party in the Dutch parliament. So everywhere the right wing is moving, the right wing is saying that the left is bankrupt, the left supposedly is progressive, the left supposedly is democratic, but what we've seen is essentially throwing away our constitution, throwing away our laws on immigration, and trying to bring in cheap labor to force wages down and to ensure that we have a different society than what we had in the beginning. And these are societies that go back thousands of years. You've got, granted, the oldest university in the world is in Fez, Morocco, that goes back to the 10th century. But the University of Bologna began about 1308, and the University of Salamanca was only a few years behind. So there is a tradition of education in Europe, European education. There's a tradition in Europe of Germans speaking German, French speaking French, Norwegian speaking Norwegian. And they're trying to create a plastic multicultural society by essentially forcing it into existence, and it's not happening. And you've got governments and countries who have essentially trying to throw away their past, and people are objecting to this. They can't possibly see this as anything useful, as anything good, as anything progressive. And there are changes being made, but there are changes for the worse. You've got people who are let into the country as migrants, and then because they don't have any papers, aren't thrown out again. That was the case of Anis Amri. He was the guy who, just a year or two ago in Breitscheidplatz in Berlin, had driven a stolen Polish truck into a crowd of Christmas goers at a market who were buying decorations for the holidays. And it turns out that the guy had several different passports, had several different identities. He had been known to the intelligence services. He had been followed by the Americans. He'd been put on the no-fly list. He had been followed by the German internal security services. And somehow they dropped following, saying we didn't see any reason to follow him anymore. And then he drove the truck into the crowd. Then they decided, well, we have enough now for a warrant for his arrest. But he escaped from Berlin, traveled through Germany, most likely traveled through France, and ended up in Italy being shot down on the street in a routine identity check in Milan. So what happened? Is there a secret Trojan horse amongst the intelligence services? If you combine the 2,800 members of the German Internal Security Service, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, and the 5,000 or 6,000 members of the Federal Criminal Office, you have a lot of people who are highly trained, who are highly skilled, and somehow they couldn't find this guy. Yet you had a situation in Germany, again in the Internal Security Service, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, where you had a homosexual who converted to Islam, and he was of Spanish origin, and he was working for the Internal Security Services, and who wanted to do something to help his brothers against the security services. And he was founded only by a fellow member of the service trolling for terrorists on various websites. Now, you tell me, does a good Muslim pose as a homosexual, and then he is a porn star to boot? That just doesn't make any sense. But somehow this happened in Germany. Additionally, in Germany, you had an Afghan migrant. You had a guy named Kavari. He had been in Freiburg in the Southwest. And again, he was a fellow who had tried to push a Greek woman off a cliff and was sentenced to 10 years in jail, most of which was commuted. He skipped parole, came to Germany, was denied asylum, but couldn't be sent home because he had no papers. And then he follows this young, beautiful medical student, daughter of a high European Union official, an attorney, follows her home from a party one night, grabs her off her bicycle, rapes her and drowns her, and then misrepresented his age as a minor of 17 because he didn't want to be tried as an adult. Well, they checked one of the tooths he had pulled by a dentist that for some reason he had kept, and found the guy was somebody in his 20s and was an adult. And I have not seen anything more about that. It's dropped off the radar because it embarrasses Angela Merkel and her government, I think. So, you know, you've got a Swiss journalist talking about the problems. You've got German government officials, for example, saying we have nothing to fear. We have our protective services, internal and external. We have security services. We have the police and so forth. And he says, these are the guys that are riding around in limousines that are armored with a police escort. And of course, they have nothing to fear. They're fine. But the ordinary Joe, he has to put up with this on the street. He announces that the news media in Germany have set themselves up as moral executioners who try to keep away from the people who read the newspapers, who watch television, who listen to the radio, the real situation about this guy Kavari, about this guy Anis Amri in Berlin. And there's a lot more crime that goes on. I was denounced, in fact, several times by my editors on the book saying, you're overemphasizing the violence. And I kept telling them that, no, I'm not overemphasizing the violence. This is only part of what's going on. And it continues. It didn't stop with the publication of the book a year ago, or a year and a half ago, I guess. It continues. I've seen articles and links online of a fellow from Niger who was a migrant. He chopped off his wife's head and one of his children's heads in a subway station in Germany. There was a situation not too long ago of the police had been sent to round up a migrant who had been marked for deportation by the courts, and they had him in the back of the police car and were taking him to the airport, and the car was surrounded by a huge mob of migrants, and the officers feared for their lives, so they released the migrant. Eventually, he was finally deported when they got reinforcements and broke into the migrant camp. But this continues. You read about the migrant camps being broken up in Paris, but it's buried in the back pages of the newspaper, and you're lucky to see it on television. So I think that that's the major issue, that Europe is being wrecked by the waves of migrants driven out, again, by American and British and French and Israeli actions in South Asia, Southwest Asia, and North Africa. You've got people with somehow managed to provide them with brand new rubber boats, brand new outboard motors, and they sail from Libya out across the Mediterranean, where they're picked up by German ships sent especially out to bring migrants to Germany for cheap labor and to make it a more multicultural society. And you've got nobody doing anything at all about the American wars in the Middle East. Nobody is doing anything at all about the money that's going to fund these wars. It could be better used to help the poor migrants, the people who have been ripped out of their homes, who have been dehoused, deculturalized, and the country's destabilized and destroyed. So take this money, send it to the Middle East, do a Marshall Plan, recreate their businesses, rebuild their houses, rebuild their water treatment plants, rebuild their sewage treatment plants, use the money to send them home where they're happy. Instead, you've got them in Europe where they don't fit in, and countries like Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and all of the Gulf states, from Kuwait down to Oman, they haven't taken a single, well, maybe a handful of migrants, but they basically say, we can't take care of this. It's somebody else's problem. Well, whose problem is it? That of the United States and that of the members of NATO. That's the issue. And if you want to read more about it, go to my book, Goodbye Europe, Hello Chaos, Merkel's Migrant Bomb, on Amazon and at www.michaelspringmann.com. Look me up on Facebook, look me up on Twitter, look me up on Hausfrau Weeks. I've got some articles there. And you can read about my trip to Iran and a number of other things I've written about on national security issues. And I wish you well. And please, please, please remember, as my high school teacher, George Semmel, said, a book is a machine to think with. So, folks, I urge you to start thinking. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I appreciate your being my audience. Goodbye.
Well, that was a very interesting presentation. I'm hearing an echo. A very interesting presentation from Michael Springmann, who is unfortunately not here with us to follow up and take questions. But I'm sure we'll more than make up for that with our very, very ample panel when it does get time to questions. We're going to move on now to another person I consider to be a brilliant, happy warrior, Ole Dammegard, who is originally from Sweden. I apologize, Ole, from before. I would say that there are very few, if any, people that I've ever met that have as much knowledge on this subject, this evil subject even, and yet deals with it with such grace and style and compassion as Ole does. I don't know how he does it, but thank you, Ole, for not only your contribution informationally, but your delivery. Why don't we hear now from Ole Dammegard?
Hi there, thank you so much for the presentation and or the introduction, and also for inviting me. I would like to first of all dedicate this to Jim Mars, that I consider was such a great loss that that he left us, because he was one of the great minds and the great inspirations to me. I've done this for over 30 years, and it's been an amazing trip. And I would like to share a PowerPoint presentation with you. So I'm going to do a screen share here. If you could please just let me know when you see it. Can you see it now? Can you see my screen share?
Seems fine to me, Ole.
Okay, perfect. So I would like to share to you what might be a super boring presentation, or something of immense value. I hope the later. But, well, here we go. I call it, like always, a global tour of terror, because this is what I've been tracking down for so many years. And I think that I might have come up with something that can help reveal what is really going on. So prepare yourself. A global tour of terror, revealing the agenda. So the question is, what is actually going on in the world as such? And also, as with any crime, any violent crime and so, you have to look at the forensic evidence. That is what I've been trying to do, and really find the specific of the leads, the dots, the clues, whatever that can show us what's really going on. What is the actual truth of different events? And when you look at crimes, I would say sometimes you have to look for, like if it's a serial killer you're tracking down, or a serial rapist or so on, you find for similarities, symmetries in the crime scene, similarities, clues that are identical left on different crime scenes and so on, that will help you point out who the guilty part is in this. And so I've named this presentation, Find the Clues and Connect the Dots. Now, we're being told that the world is filled with Muslim terrorists looking more or less like this. or the legal version underneath. So I ask you, would a fundamentalist group be able to affect Western media? Would they be able to control what images are being used in Western media, in newspapers all over the Western world, or not? I would suggest that that would be way beyond their control. Their part would be blowing themselves up and so on, but they could not affect media in a distinguished way. So let's see, what are we seeing here? And over the years, I've done this for 30 odd years. And one of the things that I found is that I keep running into these shoes. Everywhere where there's an alleged terror attack, there are these shoes that are left there, normally more or less invisible. They're there somewhere in the image, but it's not what you're looking at, but they're always there. And one of the things that I found in my research was that I was contacted by Freemasons that told me that this is actually a Freemasonic sign that shows you one shoe off of a victim or somebody involved. One shoe off means that they're taking part of this operation voluntarily. Two shoes off means that it's a homage to the sacred space where this is being carried out. But it's one step further, I would say, because these shoes appear on so many different areas. And so if we go back in history, the shoes, what are the shoes a sign of? And when you look at in a historical way, the first time I really encountered these shoes were when it comes to the Holocaust, where they have been used massively in history books and so on, where we keep seeing these mountains of shoes of people that are said to have been killed in these death camps and so on. Also, other war zones like the Balkan War and so on, the shoes appear. You got in Honduras, the death squads, the shoes appears and so on. So it seems like the shoes are a sign that keeps being repeated. Then I can really recommend a movie called Wag the Dog. It's a very, very interesting film with Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman. And it's about how when a president is in a tricky spot, how they can call in experts and set up a diversion. In this case, it's a movie where it's almost identical to the situation with Bill Clinton in the White House and Monica Lewinsky, and how they needed to divert the attention away from this disaster. And so in the movie, they very realistically create a war that doesn't exist against Albania because it's so far away that most people in the States haven't even got a clue where it is. So they do that in media. They stage the whole thing, divert the attention away. And one of the key things in this movie is the shoe here as well. They come up with this theme of a shoe. They throw up some shoes over a telephone pole and up in some trees and so on. They even get Willie Nelson to play a song like they make out. It's like recorded in the 1920s called The Old Shoe. And the hero, the returning war hero that they need also in this drama, they always need heroes when they do the storytelling of these alleged events. And the guy that they bring home he's played by Woody Harrelson, and he's called the Old Shoe as well. So the shoe is very, very central in this. And I've done many interviews on this theme. And lately I also done interviews with a CIA former whistleblower, former private contractor called Cody Snodgrass, which I think is one of the most important whistleblowers in modern times, at least at this point. Very, very incredible information he's coming out with. And we were doing a show together, and I kept talking about these shoes, and then he said, have you ever thought of that when people are being broken down in mind control experiments, for instance, like they're being created into assassins or fall guys or whatever, what they do in these very brutal methods to create patsies that can be used for whatever, they break them down through horrific tortures, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, you name it, absolute pure pain. And while doing it, one of the things they do is they hold up like symbols in front of the person that are being subjected to this horrific treatment. And this symbol they always use the same symbol for this same individual. It could be like upside down swimming dolphins or wavy lines or whatever. And this then becomes a trigger, like a trigger image that can be used with this individual to trigger him into becoming in that alternative state of mind, or alternative personality can then be used to activate this agent. I mean, they can activate a second part of the personality with the trigger in itself. And Cody said, I believe that these shoes are there as a trigger, so that every time we see an alleged terror event or anything horrific actions that are really fear boosting in the population, they leave these shoes there as a trigger. So I'm asking myself, that made a lot of sense. So I'm asking myself, is this possible? Are these shoes that are left there in so many different images there to trigger us, to keep us in fear mode? And if so, is it being used sort of in an organized way? Is it possible that we're seeing alleged terror attacks, war zones, suicide bombers around the planet that are actually coordinated and are actually where these shoes are left there as a trigger through media to keep the rest of us in massive fear mode, constant fear mode? I ask you, and this is what I would like this presentation to be about. So here we see also articles in the newspapers, they use the shoe. What has a shoe to do anything with a terror attack? For instance, here, which countries have had the most terrorist attacks? What on earth has a shoe to do with that? If I used to work as a photographer and journalist, if I'd come home with a photo of a shoe after an alleged terror attack, I would have get my butt kicked. I mean, I would have been fired, saying, what were you thinking? I mean, come on, get a photo of what is really important. So why the shoe? We look at the different countries and so on where alleged terror attacks have happened, suicide bombers, alleged suicide bombers and so on. And for instance, in 2016, it's the same countries more or less now. We had Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, Syria, Somalia, India, the Philippines, Yemen, Thailand are the main ones. And then the rest of the world has about 10% of them. So let's have a look at different countries and see if we're able to find these shoes. So here we have the Westminster Bridge attack, where very, very bizarrely, you have like here to the right, this woman is trying to save this man after this alleged attack. And what have they done? She's giving him mouth to mouth and so on. But before that, she's made absolute sure to take off his shoe, put them very neatly on the pavement, and right there for the photographer to get a shot of the shoes there. We have different victims. I'm just showing a few here because I've got hundreds and hundreds where victims are coming with one shoe off. That means that person is taking part of this operation voluntarily, if it is one of these signs. Also, the shoes are left everywhere. We continue here. It's not all of these photos I'm going to show to you are different attacks, different alleged suicide bombers, and so on, not from the same event. So here we have the London Bridge attack, which was not the same as the Westminster Bridge. What do we see? We find a shoe placed extremely central in one of the images. And these shoes, they just have to be there in a subtle way for us for our subconscious to grab it and get it in there. Here we have the Manchester arena bombing, the alleged bombing there. Please, every time I say the name of a terror attack, add the word alleged before it. So here, the shoes. Here's one of the woman here. It said that she was hit by shrapnel from the bomb, and they show the shoe. We stand together, the shoes are there. People that come out from there, they come without the shoes. Why would you take your shoes off if you're trying to escape or you're coming out of an attack? Here we have the Westminster Bridge attack where a police officer is said to have been stabbed to death. where an MP is out there instead of the normal medical people here, the ambulance drivers and so on, doing CPR. This man, the MP, is doing CPR and later named a hero. Once again, the hero. He was knighted by the Queen and so on. He was also in charge of when a lot of English tourists was killed in Tunisia. He was also in charge of that whole operation. And here we have like his bare feet are almost like a religious old painting where you can see hallelujah in the background. The feet are the center of the image. So there was one guy that had tried to save his life. He does not appear on any photos, but he was invited to the TV studios next morning. And how did he come into the studio? He came without no shoes, because he said he lost the shoes when he tried to save this police officer. I don't know how you lose your shoes doing that. And then, of course, when he was invited for the first time on national TV, I would suggest, were they the only shoes you had? Maybe you should put on some other ones, get some, buy some, take some sandals, at least socks. No, here he came bare feet into the studio, and his bare feet was part of the conversation. I would suggest that these shoes and bare feet, both as being Freemasonic symbols, triggers, but it's also, I would say, possibly like a business card that they leave behind them when these are the operations. So in media in England, what was the images that was being spread on the newspapers? They were the shoes. You see, had this strange blood underneath it. There's no blood coming from the body, but here we have this alleged victim. You can also see that these shoes have hardly been walked on. I believe that this was not a real body, but here you have the image, the shoe again, triggering. Madeleine McCann, this girl that was kidnapped, and nobody really knows what happened to a very famous case in England and has spread all over the world. When that was lately reported in the news, what was the image used? The shoes. Then here, some latest thing also when it comes to other events, like here is an alleged accident from an airplane show, an exhibition where it said that the plane crashed. What is the photo? Is it of the crashed plane? Is it of some cars that is said to turn on fire, of the victims? No, a shoe. Here we have, very recently, there was 2 police officers stabbed in Greenock in England. What is the photo? The shoe. There's a whole wave of stabbings in the UK at the moment where the shoes are there every single time. The shoe, the shoe, the shoe, the shoe. And then when Theresa May, the Prime Minister of England, when she celebrated Christmas, what did she put on top of her Christmas tree? A shoe. I mean, who does that? If it's not a message being sent out there, also for the people in the know, people that are involved in these operations, are this sort of like a secret communication system that every time they send out this message, people in the know around the world, they will see, okay, that's our operation, that's another one, that's another one. have not been able to prove this, but I'm asking the question. So here, let's go to France. We got the Charlie Hebdo. What is outside the car of the terrorist? A shoe. When they run over, they've said to have shot this police officer. They run back, and the guy on the passenger seat, what does he do? He picks up the shoe, throws it in the car, and they take off, even though he has got two shoes on and the other shoe as well. So there was an additional shoe, and why did he even bother to pick it up? You got other terror events in France, the shoe. You got the riots afterwards. You got like almost the eyes wide shut individual in the black cape there at the bottom right, and right in front of it, a shoe. And then you got the Charlie Hebdo, the Bataclan one, shoes again, left there, and more or less always Nike shoes. It's a repeated thing. Then you had the Bataclan massacre on November the 13th, 2015. And what is the symbol? You got like running blood on the wall, and somebody has goose and put there. If I got back to the newspaper with photos like this, and said, I want this photo, absolutely, the editor would say, get out of here. No way. We want good photos. What the hell were you doing collecting those shoes? What is up with these shoes? So you have to ask yourself, how come that they have been published in mainstream media in these countries? Here we have Ireland, a recent shooting of the dad of a top-level boxer. Then you have from many of the alleged bombings by IRA, the victims, what is there? The shoes. We go to Norway. What is the image that we are being shown from the mass shootings in Norway? Shoes. Italy. Here, it is one story. I believe that there's so many stories being spread in media, mainstream media at the moment, that are just not true. They're just there as part of the whole Psy-Op into freaking us out, into believing this whole thing with mass invasion of immigrants, all the violence, the crime rates going up. It's the same in all Western European countries, the same stories. And here it's said that in Italy, these people put a homeless guy on fire. So what would you take the photo of? The burnt body, the crime scene? No, shoes. And here, after the alleged riots, there was a big football game, Juventus. What happened there? The shoes. I also want to point out, when we talk about Italy, that at this very moment, the Bilderberg meeting 2018 is taking place in Turin. And every single year, just about a week or so before, there's been an alleged terror attack, I would suggest, as a diversion for us to look the other way, look away from what is actually going on. Denmark, here we have shoes lined up. This is not about the terrorism, but this is about people who have died because they cut down on so many different areas in a society. So why the shoes? And also, who can control the media in all of these countries? You have to ask yourself, what is going on here? The Belgium airport attack, the shoes. Afterwards, there was 9,000 shoes put out in a Brussels square, had nothing to do with each other, but the shoe is used once again. Benghazi, Libya. What are the photos we're being shown after this whole thing? The shoes. Who would bring like a rubber boot and just a shoe and put it right in the center of the image? You got the crime scene in the background. What is the photographer doing, taking photos of shoes instead of being where he should be at the scene of whatever happened? Here, another one down to the right, another event, the shoes in the foreground. Spain, alleged terror attacks, different ones. What do we see? The shoes. The shoes, the shoes, the shoes. We go to Iraq. I mean, this is the home of the most terror attacks ever. What do we see? The shoes. And look at how they're positioned. It's not just a shoe. It is there to tell you something. It is there for a reason. And this lady shoe to the left, if it was part of that, wouldn't there be blood spatter on top of it, or is that one put afterwards? I would suggest when you look at it, it is put there afterwards. This is in a staged crime scene. If it's real or not, I don't know, but that one is sending out a message. In Sweden, the alleged truck attack here, shoes, shoes, shoes. Then after, there was a second truck attack in Sweden that most people haven't heard about. This truck was abandoned there. And when you look at the aerial footage of that truck, what is hanging in the telephone, on the line on top of the truck? A pair of trainers. And here there were some alleged riots in Sweden a while ago with Nazis, alleged Nazis and immigrants. And what do we see here? Once again, a pair of shoes in front of the ambulance. A normal professional photographer, if the shoes were standing there, he would kick them to the side and take a photo of the ambulance, not there. And you will see there's an additional shoe in front of the left front tire. What are they doing there? Here we have, it is a girl, 11-year-old, that is said to have been killed at the truck attack in Stockholm. I heard there's some horrific images of a torn body, very, very horrific images of a torn body of a child after this event. But I've had doctors look at that, people that have been working in emergency wards for more than 20 years, and she told me that is not a real human body, because there would have been a total bleed out. The body is totally massacred and more or less no blood whatsoever. So he said that is not a real body. And then the dad of this alleged victim, he's only done one interview, and in the interview, one of the first things that the interviewer says that, yeah, and on this day she was so happy because you had just given her a pair of shoes, didn't you? And he says, yeah. So the shoes. Here, there was a nightclub shooting, a mass shooting at a nightclub, the Regina Club in Istanbul. What are the photos were being shown? Shoes. Here's another alleged attack in Turkey. Shoe. Here, another one. Here at another one. They're not the same events. Please understand that these come from different terror attacks. And here we have the Ankara airport terror attack. Why on earth would you place a pair of trainers in the front of the image if they were not very important? It's taking up like 1/4 of the image. Nike trainers. Tunisia, the alleged terror attacks there. What are the photos that are being shared in international media? Shoes, shoes, shoes. And this was where this MP in England, he was in charge of that. Even in Iran, we have an alleged shooting of a politician here. And what is left on the crime scene? A shoe. Pakistan. I mean, is this getting boring for you? Because it's very repetitive. But then again, please see what is going on here. The alleged terror attacks, the alleged suicide bombers, the alleged all of these things. But as part of the operation, this is what we're being shown. And here we have an alleged mass shooting, which was an incredible shooting. It was in Peshawar at a school. You got a major shoe there as well. And at this shooting, it was very different from other shootings, because here on BBC and many other photos from the event, there were photos of Noah Posner, a young boy, 6 years old, that was said to have been killed in Sandy Hook 2 years earlier. And you can see it's the same photo. Even his father has been confronted with this, asking him, how could your son reappear and get killed yet again 2 years later, almost on the day, but this time in Peshawar, Pakistan. And when you look at the official crime photos, you have all of this horrific stuff, blood, 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 and what is in the center of the image? Shoes. Yemen. How surprising. Shoes, 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 shoes. All of these alleged suicide attacks leaving shoes. Syria. Agony of victims, napalm. Whoa, that went very fast. Don't know what happened there. The shoes again. School bombings, suicide bombers, they show the shoes. Nike shoes once again. Here, they're also from a nursery. They said that they blew up a nursery. What do we see here? Blood stains and shoes. And please notice that the color of the blood is extremely red, even though it's said to be hours and hours after these alleged events, that the blood is still this very, very powerful red, which is not normal. I mean, blood very quickly goes into a brown, rusty type of color, depending, of course, from where in the body it comes from and the amount of oxygen and so on. But it oxidized very, very quickly. And here more in Syria, also a photo propaganda thing against Assad with the shoes right on top of his photo. Nepal, of all places, there was a cathedral bombing there. And so, of course, what images would you use? A shoe. Russia, here's an alleged plane crash in Russia. So what do you take photos of? The plane, I would suggest, would be a good idea. No, the shoe. Somalia, here we come. How surprising indeed. Here we go to Palestine, Israel. So here is a pizzeria blown up in Israel or Palestine. So what do we see? We see broken glass and a pair of shoes. We got more from Israel here. And when you look at these operations, I mean, the things that comes every single time when it comes to force flag terror, Mossad is there, CIA is there, working hand in hand, being in bed together, sometimes MI6, sometimes also using the intelligence agencies in whatever country they're carrying it out. And sometimes they use agencies from neighboring countries that will then carry out the operation, but will not be easily identified as would local agencies, because you never use the people from the same country, because they could be identified just by coincidence and so on. So you always use from other countries. Here also a Palestinian so-called terrorist is being arrested here. What have we got in the middle of the photo? The shoe. Shoes, shoes, shoes. So the Bali bombing 2002, what's there? The shoe. How come the FBI was there almost before the local police even came to the site? It was a massive, massive 2 explosions, the Sari Club and the Paddy Bar. I've recently been on location and checking it out. It's an incredible thing. The year after 9/11, getting Indonesia and Australia into the war of terror, and the memorial images and so on. What are we looking at? Shoes. Thailand, surprising, we got shoes again. Look at the way they're placed. Is that what it looks like if a bomb has exploded or something like that? Would you place the shoes like that? And often it's not a pair of shoes, like somebody has been killed, there would be 2 shoes, but most of the time it's just 1 shoe. And here on the equipment, when the police comes to the site in Thailand, checking out the bomb site, it says on the equipment, FBI. So I would ask, what is FBI doing in all of these countries? Because they are there, I tell you. I thought FBI was supposed to be in the US only, not anymore. Kenya, Africa, and so terror attacks, suicide bombers, what are we looking at? Shoes. University shootings, supermarket shootings. Nigeria, here we come. Shoes, shoes, shoes. More shoes from Nigeria. Afghanistan, I mean, come on, you must be kidding me. More shoes of alleged terror attacks. Afghanistan is one country that has been hit very, very badly. But they use these images, like the top left one. That is not about a terrorist attack. It's about a murder of a local politician. But what do they take of the photos of the crime scene, of the body? No, not at all. They use the shoe again.
Oli, we're a little over 30 minutes now. If you could wrap it up, we could always return to it if you have more to present during the Q&A.
Okay, let me just, it continues, shoes. Even in Canada and the US and everywhere. Let me just show you also the Boston bombing. The symbol of the whole thing of the Boston bombing is the shoe. So let me quickly show you from the Charlottesville's alleged car attack. This is the car that is said to have just crashed into the crowd and is leaving the site. And here, when the car leaves, what does it leave behind? A shoe. We go to Mission Impossible 3, the third one. Look at this one. Boom. And the shoe. So who on earth have the power to coordinate all of these things? And also recently, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the master of terror, if you ask me, he invited the Japanese PM for dinner. And what was the dessert? It was served in a shoe, which I would say is the ultimate insult. And here you got like Nike shoes, even with blood spatter on some of their models. And they've even used it in their marketing. You may not survive the blast, but your shoes will. I mean, somebody needs to ask Nike what is going on. And while looking for all of these images, I came across this image. And when I clicked on it, guess where it's linked? I click on it, and where did it take me? The CIA's own website, cia.gov. And I would say this is where all the dots get connected. So with that said, I want to thank you for your patience. I'm sorry if I was very repetitive, but I think there is a very clear pattern going on here. And I think it's the more we see these patterns and we start understanding what's going on and also exposing the forces behind them, then we can stop so much mayhem in this beautiful, beautiful world that is meant to be a paradise and is now turned into absolute hell for a lot of people.
Well, thank you very much, Ollie, for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I think I need to refocus my camera, so I'm just going to turn it off for a second, if you don't mind. While I do that, I'm going to keep talking. If you have more to say on this subject, we'll be happy to hear from you back in the Q&A section that follows. And just really amazing. And I'm sure there's plenty of other visual cues as well. You know, it reminded me, Ollie, that they told us that right after the September 11th attacks, Osama bin Laden put a message out to the world, basically denying that he did it, but I think saying he understood why. But we weren't allowed to see those images because supposedly there could be visual cues in them for to signal terrorist cells around the world. How interesting when you look at it in light of what you have presented.
Can I just add that I have eyewitnesses that was walking around in New York the day after 9/11, and they said there were in some street corners there were big heaps of shoes lying, and nobody really understood where they came from. They sort of thought that, well, they must be shoes from the victims, but they were there on that location as well.
On that day, September 11, 2001, I was downtown. And I was taking photographs of the historic event when the first tower collapsed. I was caught outside. I was only 3 blocks south. I got covered in dust. And later that day, I walked home to Brooklyn, over the Brooklyn Bridge. Some colleagues of mine from work who lived out in New Jersey who couldn't get home, they followed me home, and I drove them to relatives of theirs throughout Brooklyn. At the very end of the day, when I finally had some time, I went over to the hospital to get myself checked out. There was a police officer and a firefighter there. They were giving me a little bit of advice on how to get cleaned up. And a guy came in covered in dust, and he had been in the Millennium Hotel right across the street from the World Trade Center on Church Street. He was pretty banged up. The building got a lot of damage, and he only had one shoe on. So there you go.
Well,
now, I want to go to a shoe-in now, and that would be Dr. Kevin Barrett. Par excellence, an incredible truth warrior, in my opinion, and he's paid the price for it, but he is unbowed, undeterred, and I think one of the premier experts on false flag terror. Please welcome Dr. Kevin Barrett.
Well, hey, thank you, Tom. And thank you, Oli. That was a fascinating presentation. I think you've got more shoes than Imelda Marcos. I'm going to be talking about the theory of false flag terror a little bit. It's hard to study the issue of false flags because obviously the people involved in them are unwilling to divulge most of the information about them. It's only on a fairly rare number of occasions that people who have been involved in false flags will say anything at all about them. People like Robert David Steele, who actually ran a false flag for the CIA, is not allowed to say anything other than that he did that and that nobody died, but he can't go into the details. It's all still classified. So we're studying a subject that is 99% underwater, like an iceberg. We only see the tip. And to try to figure out what's going on, we have to connect the dots and work with inadequate information and all kinds of clues, as well as the hard facts that do get reported that end up ineluctably pointing towards the truth of these matters. So with that said, I'm going to say that the the presentation I'm doing is on this new book by Laurent Guyénot, From Yahweh to Zion. It's the culmination of his roughly decade study of false flags. And as a historian, I think that Laurent is in a very good position to study false flags, because journalists really have a hard time with false flags. They happen in real time. The journalists have to report in real time. And obviously, the people are not telling the truth about this. The information is not available for journalists. So it takes somebody like a historian who can piece together all of the evidence and the clues, and ultimately often go back in time to see what has emerged about events in the past, who's more likely to be able to tell us how these things work, who actually is behind them, what they do precisely, what kinds of networks carry these out, how do they give orders to do things when this is all so top secret, is there anything written, how does it get destroyed, all of this. My presentation is focusing on three contributions that Laurent has made to the study of false flags. And these, in the title, I'm listing Zionism, Psychopathy, and the Hijacked Provocation. We're going to start out with the last one, the Hijacked Provocation, and work our way to the two earlier ones. So what is a hijacked provocation? Well, before we get there, let's just introduce Laurent Guyénot. He is an engineer from the École Nationale Supérieure in Paris, and he earned his PhD a little later in medieval studies at the Sorbonne. He's written several books, some on medieval history, and his two most recent books take up the subject of false flags. JFK 9/11, published by Progressive Press a few years ago, and then From Yahweh to Zion, which I translated and published just a few months ago. And here are those two books on false flags, JFK 9/11 and From Yahweh to Zion. In the book We Are Not Charlie Hebdo, which I edited a few years ago, Dr. Guyénot contributed a terrific chapter, which I think is really the one that gives us the theory of how these hijacked provocations work, how false flags sometimes are actually run as joint operations by more than one intelligence agency. And it may be that one intelligence agency is hijacking the operation from another one. And that seems to be what happened in the 2012 Mohammed Merah affair that Dr. Guyénot discusses in his contribution to We Are Not Charlie Hebdo. This event was essentially a two-part series of events, a little bit like Charlie Hebdo itself and many other of these events. Remember, in the Charlie Hebdo event, we had a bunch of cartoonists killed allegedly by angry Muslim radicals. And then we had a shooting and kidnapping, hostage-taking event at a kosher deli, tying together the attack on the nation and on free speech, that's the cartoonists, and then the attack on Jewish targets or Israel, which was the attack on the kosher deli. The same thing happened earlier in 2012 with the Mohammed Merah affair. This is a picture of Mohammed Merah. He was the patsy who was blamed for these two totally separate and actually, in reality, probably essentially unconnected violent episodes.
Kevin, we're not seeing your slides. Screen share.
You're not? Okay. I did click on the screen share. Let me try it again.
Screen share,
Okay.
pick application.
Okay. I did that before. I'm doing it again.
There you go. That's it.
Okay. Great. Well, let's quickly run back through the earlier slides just so you see what they were. Introduction to Laurent Guyénot. His two books on false flags, JFK 9/11 and From Yahweh to Zion. From We Are Not Charlie Hebdo is the book in which he contributed this article on the Mohammed Merah affair. Now, this happened in 2012, and the first thing was on March 11th, some neo-Nazi, tattooed French, at least that's the only ID we have on these perps, these tattooed guys wearing neo-Nazi tattoos, presumably French soldiers, shot 3 North African French soldiers in Montauban, France. And various indicators suggest that this was in fact a DCRI false flag, that is a French intelligence false flag designed to demonize the National Front, the Front National, which is the supposed extreme right neo-Nazi party. in order to help Sarkozy, who was about to go down. In the previous slide, let's see if Sarkozy was in serious trouble in that election. The National Front was taking away the votes that he needed to win in the first round. And then suddenly there was this attack by apparent neo-Nazis, which demonized the National Front and actually helped Sarkozy survive in the first round. So that was the March 11th shooting. And then March 15th, another one, which helps make it even more of a publicity thing. And then on March 19th, there was a totally separate shooting at a Jewish religious school in La Roserie. 4 people were said to have been killed, but there's no evidence actually that they were. That is, no autopsies were allowed, and the victims' bodies were allegedly immediately taken to a plane and flown to Israel to be buried as national heroes. But Laurent thinks that very likely there was actually no real shooting there. Then on March 21st, Mohammed Merah, who probably had nothing to do with either event, but who was a usual suspect, who was essentially a party-hardy guy. They told us he was a radical Muslim, but he wasn't. He was not religious in the least, and he was working for the intelligence services, and therefore they were able to manipulate him, and he was set up and executed in a dramatic night-long event. He was actually killed in the evening, and then they pretended that he was still alive and kept firing shots all night, and made up a false story about him leaping through a window and so on. So it was a huge television spectacular. So the hypothesis is, according to Laurent Guyénot, that the Israeli Mossad was able to seize upon this first series of shootings of the French soldiers, the Montalban affair, and then they created a fake shooting at the Jewish school and then claimed that the same guy did it. And this of course hijacks the whole thing to use for pro-Israel publicity, sending the message to the public that those who protest the war in Afghanistan and the coming war in Iran are killers of Jewish children. And then it also left French intelligence, the DSGI, vulnerable to blackmail because they had, of course, been involved in the Montalban operation. So now they're forced to go along with the Mossad agenda because the Mossad has the goods on them. So this is a hijacked provocation. That is a false flag started by one intelligence service and its assets, and then hijacked by another one, and perhaps actually magnified by another one. Could this explain any of the major false flags that we've seen? Well, Laurent Guyénot says yes, the 2 big ones, JFK and 9/11. This is Jack Ruby on the right, or Jacob Rubenstein, who was a hired killer for Mickey Cohen, the Jewish gangster who ran the West Coast for the Meyer-Lansky syndicate at the time, and who, in fact, was implicated in killing, who walked on live television, walked into the Dallas Police Department and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy or alleged lone assassin. According to Laurent Guyénot, Gary Wien may be right. Now, how many JFK researchers have even heard of Gary Wien? Not a whole lot, but Wien actually may be barking up the right tree, according to Laurent Guyénot, and suggesting that, in fact, he got this straight from Senator John Tower, that this JFK assassination was, in fact, what Wien, or rather Tower, called the double cross of fantastic dimensions, in which a fake assassination attempt staged by Howard Hunt and the CIA originally, and there's a lot of evidence to support this, that the first plans for the Dallas coup involved creating a fake assassination attempt against Kennedy to be blamed on the Cubans to trigger war in Cuba, which Kennedy had been leaning against, but this would have inflamed the country and forced a war on Cuba. So that's the CIA original attempt on Kennedy. It was supposed to be a fake assassination. And then, according to Gary Wien's information, as well as other information, what Wien calls the Russian Jewish mafia, which is essentially Meyer-Lansky's mob, which is essentially organized crime, the biggest organized crime syndicate in the world and in the United States at that time, moved in and took it over and actually killed the president. But of course, behind this mishpaka, or the so-called Russian Jewish mob, and Meyer-Lansky, of course, we have the Israeli Mossad, David Ben-Gurion, who had just resigned in outrage over Kennedy's insistence that Israel would never get nuclear weapons. and of course, the CIA Mossad infiltrator James Jesus Angleton was likely a major orchestrator of the Kennedy assassination as well. So this, again, we have a possibility of a hijack provocation with 9/11, as we had, according to Laurent Guyénot, perhaps a U.S. deep state plan for a more limited false flag attack, perhaps just at the Pentagon, maybe plane crashes at the Twin Towers, who knows, but something that was aimed at justifying the invasion of Afghanistan. But this then may have been taken over by the infiltrated Zionist network, whose goal was much more ambitious. This was from Yahweh to Zion. And again, Laurent Guyénot points out that the many players involved in 9/11 will essentially all have blackmail material on each other and be able to silence any who would otherwise get out of line. And that means that if indeed it were a more limited operation, in the same way that the JFK assassination may originally have been planned to be just a fake assassination attempt, here, if it were a more limited false flag that was suddenly turned into a massively murderous one with nearly 3,000 people dead, that those who had planned the more limited one would be in no position to expose the massively murderous one. And there's some evidence to suggest that Guyénot could be right about this. According to Susan Lindauer, who worked for the CIA Iraq desk, she was handled by her case officer, Richard Fuse. They both knew, Richard Fuse learned and told Susan that a huge terror attack was coming to Manhattan. Something big was coming to Manhattan anyway, in late August, early September. And then on the morning of 9/11, Susan Lindauer was on the phone with her CIA case officer, Richard Fuse, and together they watched the Twin Towers burning and then suddenly exploding. And according to Susan Lindauer, Richard Fuse's reaction was this anguished scream, "The goddamn Israelis!" This is one piece of evidence that would go along with Laurent Guyénot's hijacked provocation hypothesis. That is that people in the CIA, like Fuse, knew something was planned. It was an inside job in that sense, that the U.S. command chain was in on it, but that perhaps the murder of 3,000 people was a little more than they had realized was going to happen. There's all sorts of evidence that Israel was behind what happened at the Twin Towers. So another piece of evidence suggesting that 9/11 may have been this kind of hijacked provocation is the testimony from people on board Air Force One that essentially they were targeted by somebody on the inside who had the code name for Air Force One, that was Angel, was threatening to shoot George W. Bush out of the skies after his plane took off from the elementary school in Florida. And so this means that there was a coup d'etat style attack from one rogue network within the government against the rest of the government, as Webster Tarpley has pointed out in his work. And Bush, while on Air Force One, here he is on Air Force One on September 11th, he begged to return to Washington and take command, and Cheney refused the president's direct order, telling you who was actually acting president on September 11th. This, of course, was an act of treason by Cheney. Bush was sent to Barksdale Air Force Base and then finally to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska against Bush's own wishes. Something happened to him there at Offutt Air Force Base. We don't know what. Then he was flown back to Washington, and that night he did his hostage video TV thing and said, America is at war, read his lines that he was ordered to read. So there was obviously a coup d'etat by one faction of the government against other factions. And again, this goes along with Laurent Guyénot's hijacked provocation hypothesis. So more details about this hijacking of Air Force One and the threats against Air Force One came out just a couple of years ago on 9/11/2016 from NBC News, of all places, that Bush was furious and virtually unable to communicate with the outside world. So that is the coup plotters had essentially gotten control of the president. And perhaps Cheney was on board with some of those Israeli coup plotters. So an overview of hijacked provocations includes that in all of these examples that we've seen, and there are a few others as well, we have a Western intelligence agency scheduling some kind of illegal operation, whether it's French intelligence shooting a couple of its own soldiers as a favor to Sarkozy to help him get elected, or it's the CIA setting up what's supposed to originally be a fake assassination attempt on Kennedy, or it's the CIA or Bush and the U.S. people setting up some kind of limited false flag on 9/11. Then it's hijacked and massively magnified, and especially in the latter two cases by Israeli intelligence in collusion with their network of Zionism, and which of course are the 100,000 plus Jewish people around the world who are willing to volunteer for Mossad. Many of these people are in the very highest positions of power in countries all over the world. And then elements of organized crime, which is also largely dominated by people who are ethnically Jewish and who have a loyalty to the state of Israel. So the result is that the false flag is turned to serve Israel's interest. And those who know what happened, like Richard Fuse, the CIA case officer who knew something was coming on 9/11, and then who realized what Israel did afterwards, have already been implicated, and they have to stay silent. And then Richard Fuse also got, I think it was something like $10 million in hush money after 9/11, which he used to build a mansion near Washington, D.C., as Susan Lindauer has described. If you want a kind of a sketch of how this is done, check out John le Carré's book, The Little Drummer Girl. It's ostensibly a novel, but it's all based on information that John le Carré got from Shlomo Argov, from an inside Mossad source who describes precisely what the Mossad has been doing, how it runs rings around Western intelligence agencies in creating the theater of terror, that is false flag terror events. And another kind of hijacking is hijacking of truth movements. Laurent Guyénot argues that much of the 9/11 truth movement has knowingly or unknowingly been hijacked by Israel. The inside job phrase, he argues, is a catchphrase invented by Israel precisely to threaten the American government with massive destabilization if anybody in the American government ever tries to come forward with the truth about 9/11, which is that it was primarily an Israeli operation. Then they're in a position to bring down the American House by having prepared this truth movement saying inside job, inside job, inside job. It was the Americans that did it, the Americans that did it. Well, Guyénot argues that the major false flags in particular are disproportionately Zionist or Israeli. He points out that Israel has a long history and grand expertise in false flag terror. A world history of false flag operations would need to dedicate at least half its pages to modern Israel, a nation less than half a century old. And I've listed some of the examples. Some of these false flags are admitted. The King David Hotel bombing, in which Mossad operatives or proto-Mossad operatives dressed up as Arabs blew up the King David Hotel. The Lavon affair, in which Mossad operatives targeted Americans in Egypt and would have killed many Americans if, fortunately, things hadn't gone wrong for them. The Israeli government recently, not long ago, admitted that the Lavon affair happened, that they did it, and then it gave honors and medals to the people who had planned to murder Americans in Egypt in a false flag attack. So how do we explain this Zionist preeminence in false flags? Laurent Guyénot argues that this paranoid, they want to kill us mentality is inculcated by Jewish scripture, that every year Jews celebrate the plagues of Egypt, the killing of the firstborn Egyptians. The book of Esther celebrates the murder of, I think, 70,000 Persians who were supposedly plotting against the Jews. There's this paranoid notion. They want to get us, they want to kill us, they want another Holocaust, yada, yada, yada. That excuses everything that we do. So that essentially takes away all restraints, moral scruples, and leads to extreme behavior. Then there's the extreme difficulty of fewer than 15 million Jews invading, occupying, and genocidally taking over the Holy Land of 4 billion Christians and Muslims. Naturally, bold measures would be required for such a nearly impossible project. And then there's the International Zionism Network and the envy of all other intelligence agencies, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people around the world, many in the very highest positions, who are willing to volunteer free of charge to do anything for the Israeli Mossad. Then there's media dominance. Those who run the media decide which lies stand and which lies fall. And media in the Western world is heavily dominated by people who are ethnically Jewish with some degree of loyalty to Israel. They will never let out the truth about an Israeli false flag. They're inculcated to fear that terrible things will happen if they do. And finally, the domination of international organized crime and secret societies, banking, and politics, again, by ethnically Jewish people, many, if not most of whom, have some degree of loyalty to the state of Israel. Finally, the psychopathy issue. Laurent Guyénot, in his article, Israel, the Psychopathic Nation, takes up where Andrzej Lobachowski left off in Political Ponerology, in which he argues whole nations can go psychopathic. Laurent argues that Israel has gone psychopathic in the same way that some communist countries did, according to Lobachowski, perhaps Nazi Germany did, and so on. He argues that the Jewish nation as a state, but also as an organized world community, acts collectively towards other nations and other human communities in the way a psychopath acts towards his fellow men. Disclaimer, it goes without saying, he says, that I do not intend to imply that, quote unquote, the Jews are psychopaths, but instead that they are the first victims of a mental straitjacket imposed by their elites, who through the veritable intellectual terrorism make of them, to the extent that they comply, the instruments of the collective psychopathy of Israel. So this is collective psychopathy. It's not saying that individual Jewish people are psychopathic, far from it. Israelis are always, and Zionists, and to some extent people who identify strongly tribally as Jewish, are always innocent victims. They see themselves as innocent, always innocent, no matter what they do. The other guy is always wrong. Everywhere we've gone, we've been persecuted and tormented and exterminated, and it's always been their fault. Well, this is exactly what psychopaths say. Martha Stout, one of the world's leading experts on psychopaths, says this is the first clue to a psychopath, is the other guy is always wrong. And then Israel's relationship to the United States, according to Guyénot, is that of a typical psychopath who has influenced a powerful and impressionable man that he's going to use to accomplish his misdeeds. And Laurent compares this to Colonel House, the Zionist manipulator of President Wilson, who dragged the United States into World War I. Not all Zionist leaders are even willing members of this kind of psychopathic group contagion. Moshe Sharet was a very honorable, noble, and ethical Israeli leader. He was the foreign minister from 1948 to 1956, and then the prime minister, who was horrified by the methods of Ben-Gurion and other more mainstream Zionists who were dedicated to set the Middle East on fire and frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims by, quote, raising terrorism to the level of a sacred principle. That is precisely what Israel has done, and certainly never so much so as since 9/11. So why are people like Sharet and other ethical Israeli leaders, and there have been some, why can't they overcome the psychopathic ideological power machine of Zionism? And finally, this is Laurent Guyénot's argument that he makes in From Yahweh to Zion, that this is rooted in the Bible. He says, in the final analysis, does not the Zionist manipulation go back to the creation by these ancient priests, the Levites, of a tribal god by the name of Yahweh, who has usurped the title of the creator of the universe and father of humanity? Ultimately, is not Zionism the logical outcome of Yahwism? And then he writes in this article, this is a question I will reserve for another article. Well, in fact, that article turned into a moderately long book, 500 some pages, From Yahweh to Zion, which again, I translated from French and published a couple of months ago, earlier this year. So if you want to follow up on this and entertain this very provocative and of course controversial argument, I highly recommend reading From Yahweh to Zion. It got a very favorable, somewhat, including a disclaimer, but a very favorable review from John Cobb, who is probably the world's greatest liberal Christian theologian. And it's also gotten rave reviews from people like Gilad Atzmon and others that you would expect to appreciate this material. It's a very fair-minded attempt to look at the so-called Jewish question throughout history and find out to what extent these issues are rooted in kind of a culture. It's not racist. It's not about biology. It's all about culture. And we are in a position where we do have to analyze cultural influences on political behavior if we want to understand what's really going on, and especially what's been really going on in the world since September 11th, 2001. So I'm not sure where I am in time, but I wanted to get through this as early as possible so we'd still have plenty of time for some Q&A. So
Kevin, you've had a good 30 minutes plus, and
Good.
there is
Okay.
about 15 minutes left in this panel if we would like to open it to Q&A.
Okay, let's do it.
Very good. Well, thank you for a very, very interesting presentation, all of you, and Kevin, especially yours here at the end. Apparently, there's not enough time for all of us to go into what we would like. Do we have any questions, organizers, or should we just go ahead and go with some questions I have? I think I haven't been presented with any questions, so I am going to pose a couple myself anyway. Michael Springmann's topic seemed to be a bit off topic, although it is an important one. I'm sure, Kevin, you've got a lot to say about that, and I'd be very interested to hear about it. However, something comes to mind with me that sort of bridges the two things. Germany has been well prepared, I think, for this migration issue. I used to live there. I was in the service. I speak German. I know a lot of Germans. And young people, most Germans who were around during World War II are long gone now. And the few that were probably children. Yet the entire country has been beaten into submission as if there is some, I call it Holocaust original sin, as if there's something genetic in the German people that can be stirred into a crazy rage against Jews at any moment. Therefore, we're not allowed to say certain things. We have to accept anything that comes down the pike. Do you have any opinion about that, Kevin?
Well, sure. I think that this again, Laurent Guyénot's book From Yahweh to Zion gets into the way that the history of the 20th and this first part of the 21st century has been steered to a certain extent by these Zionist elites. And clearly Germany suffered from this, first by being made the loser of World War I and then having its economy utterly destroyed. All of this was essentially done as part of a quid pro quo in which Rothschild offered the British victory in World War I by way of bringing the U.S. into the war if the British promised the Rothschilds Palestine. And of course, that deal was made and it was adhered to. So, Germany was the loser. So then Hitler arose after the war, expressing the rage of the German people about this horrific stab in the back that had totally destroyed and impoverished their country. And then Hitler probably was also financed by some of these same Rothschild-linked forces, precisely to have another even more destructive war that was necessary to create Israel's existence. So I think Germany has been brutalized, and like an abused child who identifies with their abuser, Germany is identifying with its Zionist abusers. Now, I'm not saying that means that Germany should turn around and start identifying with Hitler or the Nazis. No, that Hitler and the Nazis were actually, steered to some extent and created to some extent by the same Zionist abusers. But Germany needs to wake up and grow up and stop being an abused child and take responsibility for its actions. And the first thing it needs to do is take responsibility for its complicity in the genocide of Palestine, which Germany is participating in by way of this blackmail and guilt that's being run by the Zionists.
I think it's also important to note that in Germany, European Judaism and Jewish culture society rose to its absolutely highest heights in Europe, because it was the doors were open and the German people were very accepting and accommodating. After World War I, as you point out, with the Balfour Declaration, certainly the Nazi Party was not in existence yet at the end of World War I, although the ultra-left communists were, okay, and they had their sights set on Germany. So we've got this uber-nationalist German Adolf Hitler, who thinks they should have won World War I, finds out that this trusted group, among us that, we've exalted, as you put it, stabbed us in the back. I mean, that's a kind of a backstory that we're not allowed to hear, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And From Yahweh to Zion, Laurent Guyénot gets into this in some detail. Now, he's not a Holocaust revisionist by any means. There's nothing in From Yahweh to Zion that suggests that he is questioning these various facts about the Holocaust that have been disputed. But what he does do is show where that rage came from that allowed the emergence of Hitler.
Barbara, if I may ask you a question, we've heard some very interesting new theories to me, although I can't keep up on it as much as you all do. I'm more of a generalist by necessity.
A good one.
Well, thank you very much. With people like you, it's very easy to be that way. Can you tell us, have you heard this theory before of a double false flag, one being sort of halfway measure and then being co-opted by a larger one? Have you ever heard that before, A? And B, if you have, what's your opinion of it?
Well, thank you for asking. The first thing I'd like to do is ask Alan, who's doing our audio visual, to please bring up the answer to the question about 9/11 as to, this answers your question specifically on 9/11. Most people don't know this, but if in a moment when I'm done saying this, Alan, if you could bring up my slide 66, which is an image of the actual destruction at the Pentagon at 9:32 and 30 seconds, which was over 5 minutes before the official story says a plane even got anywhere close to Washington, D.C. And you will see massive destruction, guess where? At the helipad, right off of the west face of the Pentagon. And that's where the real attack took place. And it happened at 9:32 and 30 seconds. And we know that because it stopped the Pentagon heliport clock at precisely that time, like April Gallup stopped wristwatch that stopped 2 minutes and 30 seconds earlier from an inside explosion, not far, but inside the wall. So why does this matter? Most people don't know this, but it's an critical fact of 9/11. Before the attacks even started, when Bush was down in the school, he'd been there the night before, that morning, after whatever he was planned to do, scheduled to do, pre-scheduled to do at the Florida school, his schedule had him arriving, guess what, by helicopter at the Pentagon heliport. So the people who blew up their own Pentagon by pre-placed explosives, both inside the building and out, they sent a real clear message to George Bush, and it was delivered by Dick Cheney, the vice president, in a phone call right after Bush was finally whisked out of the school, or excuse me, right after he was finally whisked out of the classroom. So between the time that he was whisked out of the classroom and when he started his 2-minute press event, still in the Florida school, but not in the classroom, which was at 9:30. At 9:30, when he started that press event, the bombs went off literally at the helipad where he was supposed to next go, according to his pre-published schedule. So the bottom line is, it is very clear, and you can see this in Behind the Smoke Curtain, which is on YouTube under that title. It's got over 500,000 views. You will be able to see all of the evidence that that at least Bush, the Bush side, they expected and they knew and they were complicit in the false flag attacks on World Trade Centers 1 and 2. I'm putting aside World Trade Center 7, which didn't happen until 5:20 that afternoon. However, they didn't know about the Pentagon attack. And it is clear that all officialdom scrambled and that the Secret Service instantly reacted as if it were a real unexpected actual attack that might have something to do with harming the president, Bush, and actually prevented him from returning to the Pentagon helipad when the Pentagon helipad was destroyed at 9:32 and 30 seconds. And that's all I'm going to say right now. Yes, they do piggyback, and it was the Zionists on the inside who blew up the Pentagon, and of course, they were also totally complicit, Israel, with Silverstein and the Zionists blowing up the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center 7 in New York City. But if you could please bring up slide number 66, and you will see precisely what it looked like right after 9:32 and 30 seconds when the real attack, the second attack actually, the first one outside the building at the Pentagon happened. And this is precisely where George Bush was supposed to arrive between 12 and 12:30 according to his pre-schedule. Could we see just that one slide, please? Slide number 66.
Yeah, we see it. It's up there.
Oh, okay. I don't see that. Fine. So yeah, here's the bottom line. People need to know that these evildoers, there is one intelligence agency or government that plans something, and it violates the law. It may or may not just have crisis actors and fake blood, but you also need to know that other insiders who are fully aware of these counterterrorism exercise scenarios in advance, or counterterrorism exercise, or emergency response exercise, or military drill, They piggyback actual shootings and actual explosions, actual bombs, on top of these mere exercises. So we need, as a people of the world, who are the targets of all of these things for psychological and political, geopolitical reasons, we need to do whatever is necessary to educate people to know that what would happen if they held a false flag attack and no victims showed up. And there are ways to make that happen. Thank you.
I think it's fascinating because, yes, they do use crisis actors, but even those people who are in it at a very low level seem to keep their mouth shut. It's a conundrum. Oli Dammegard, you've been sitting back listening to all this. What's your commentary?
Could I just make a quick comment on the question, if I understood it right? I made several interviews with CIA whistleblower Chip Tatum, who has been part of some false flag operations during his career. Mm-hmm. And what he told me once was that the people behind these operations from the day at the office, they're like very casual about it, the whole setup. And it's just like with marketing agencies, like marketing a product, you need to check with the audience, did this campaign get the right effect, or do we need to add it? Do we need to amplify it? And he said it's exactly like this, but what they're looking for is it's not to promote a product. What they want to is promote fear, because fear is the control tool. So that's the whole key to these operations. And he said that the forces behind these operations, they follow it very clearly in live time. And then they see, did we get the reaction we wanted, or do we need to amplify? And sometimes you will see, if I understand this question correctly, that is exactly what they're asking about. Sometimes you will see like, boom, something happens, and then there's a delay, and then a secondary operation takes place, maybe in the neighboring country or something, a similar but smaller event, just to sort of really knock it all the way in, kick it all the way in. And then, okay, now they got the effect they wanted. And so that's it. So often you will see, and I'm looking for these things as well, when something happens, instead of just looking where mainstream media says, look here, look here, look here, I check 360 and then boom. Sometimes, yep, there it is, there it is. Oh no, there it is. So.
And I'd just like to add, if I could, 20 seconds, because I know we're close to the end of the panel. A perfect example that has directly to do with 9/11 itself is that after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, remember, there was one in 1993 before 2001. And that was a single bomb that was placed by the B-2 column in the basement of World Trade Center 1. It killed about 5 people and injured about 1,000. And after that attack, which we know now, the bombing material was actually provided by and allowed to go forward by the FBI handler of Mr. Salem, who was the FBI informant inside of the Blind Sheik's operation. Okay, with Ramzi Youssef, who's now in high security federal prison for life for it. But right after the 1993 World Trade Center 1 bombing, Stephen Emerson, who is a very, I don't believe most of what he says because he's a right-wing Zionist. Nevertheless, he has reported publicly, and it's in Behind the Smoke Curtain, my YouTube on the Pentagon attack. Stephen Emerson reported right after the 1993 World Trade Center attack, he talked to an FBI agent who said there weren't enough deaths this time. So it is very, very clear they need a critical mass of actual deaths during these operations in order to achieve the maintenance of the fear. And that is precisely what happened. The 1993 attack was their dry run for 9/11, and then they did 9/11. And I actually have slides in my presentation, which I wasn't able to get to. But again, please ask for, I will provide my PowerPoint slides to anyone who asks, and we'll get them up on YouTube with the link. But there is a slide that gives the responses after 9/11, the public statements by the people who clearly did 9/11, Wolfowitz, Paul Wolfowitz, and others, Brzezinski, to the effect how ecstatic they were, that there were so many deaths, and it was even more than Pearl Harbor.
If I may, amend and add to your remark there. What if they gave a false flag attack and nobody was afraid? I think that would be
also right.
an optimal one. I have being a New Yorker or former New Yorker now. I escaped, but on 9/11, I worked in the financial district just downtown. Cantor Fitzgerald was one of my clients. I'm very familiar with the area. I've been in the World Trade Center towers many times. I have a theory that I'd like to share with you all and see what you think. It's, I think, highly important to note that both the World Trade Center attacks, the one in 93 and the one in 2001, happened in relatively early in the term of a new president. Okay. I think in the case of 93, it was supposed to be President Bush, but he was upset by Paul, what's his name, being in the race, the independent
Perot.
that year.
Ross Perot.
Ross Perot,
Perot.
correct. And so Clinton slips in. In the case of George Bush's son, the 2000 election had to be stolen to make sure he was the guy in the White House so that we would have the right attitude to deal with the aftermath of 9/11.
And it was stolen by his brother Jeb Bush down in Florida.
Right. So in other words, a new president has at least 3+ years to react, and maybe even almost 8, so that once you've set the table. I think that the 93 attack was set up for George Bush to do something much bigger, and when he lost, I think they were all dressed up and nowhere to go, and they said, you know what, let's let it happen anyway, not on the same scale, but it'll be a table-setting event for the big show to come later on when we get the right guy back in the White House. And we had all of these Psy-Op stories about children in madrasas in Pakistan and so forth, drawing pictures of the World Trade Center and the Sears Tower, saying, I want to get there and do that. What do you all think of that?
It's absolutely true. In fact, it all would have happened, I believe, way back during Gerald Ford, who expected, they expected, don't forget that as soon as Watergate was ginned up, and that was to get Nixon out and to get Ford in, with the Ford's pre-agreeing to put Bush Sr. in charge of the CIA, after which CIA headquarters is named against for Bush Sr., that they were going to do all of these 9/11 operation or something of that scale back then, but Carter won. And so they had to get rid of him with the October surprise, which Bush Sr. did at the October Surprise Paris meeting, the subject of my book, October Surprise. Well,
you and also Kevin have been part of our INN symposium on 9/11 that we used to have on a yearly basis. I don't know if you remember, but Dick Gregory, the great activist and comedian, was at one of them. Mm-hmm. And he said that Martha Mitchell told him that she had heard a discussion in their New York City apartment about the World Trade Center being brought down. Mm-hmm. And right after that, she got whisked off to the crazy booby hatch and injected with all this stuff, and she wasn't alive much longer after that. I never got a chance to follow up with it, but I thought it was a very
that just confirms what I said. It's clear to me that they would have done it had Ford been reelected.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, we could go on, but unfortunately we would be eating into the much needed break that we have to have between the next this panel and the next one. I want to thank you all. Let's go very quickly, starting with you, Barbara. If some people who are not familiar with your work, but are now as a result of this symposium, want to follow up and get more information on your writings and your work, where should they go?
Thank you. Well, first off, email me, and that's BS, like perfect for a writer, right? BS Honegger. So BSHONEGG @gmail.com, BSHONEGG @gmail.com, and request my PowerPoint slides. I wasn't able to get to about a third of them. They're very important. They speak for themselves. That would be the best background, and a deep background, but quick background for a backgrounder. And then go to Behind the Smoke Curtain on YouTube. Has over 500,000 views. It's what you need to know about what happened and what didn't, and why it matters at the Pentagon on 9/11, which was the critical attack of 9/11, without which they could not have made it a war on terror, because or a new Pearl Harbor. Obviously, they needed an iconic national military facility to be visibly attacked, and that was the Pentagon. And then also go to YouTube and watch the 9/11 Museum virtual walking tour, which Bonnie Faulkner and I did. And what that does is that uses photographs and the captions from the actual physical exhibit items in the official 9/11 museum at Ground Zero to prove that the official story that they are literally trying to place in stone forever is a huge Hitlerian big lie, and it uses their own exhibit items to do it. Thank you.
And anybody who goes there, if you haven't gone there already, if you're going to go back, freak them out, really flip them out and say, where's building 7?
Right.
And they walk you all through the place to this little room, and there's a little screen somewhere. And so you got to push this button, and then it shows building 7 come down.
Same thing with the hijackers. The 19 hijackers are hidden down below, not even in the main exhibit, because they didn't do it.
Okay, we got to be brief here because we're running out of time. In order of appearance, now we're going to go to Oli. Oli, please let everybody know. I'm sure you've gotten a lot of new fans today, enthusiasts of your work. Where should they go to find out more?
My website is lightonconspiracies.com. You can also find me on Facebook. That I've turned my Facebook page into like a headquarters for I don't know what to call it, like resistance movement, where I get global information about upcoming drills from all over the place, because the drills are always part of these operations. The drills are always there. So the more of them that we can expose before they actually happen, and I direct people there with cameras and so on, so we can hopefully start filming the people setting it up, and then thus defuse at least some of them. Lightonconspiracies.com. I got multiple books on Amazon as well. And before I go, I just want to mention that any one of you who knows Sidethorn and his partner Conspiracy Granny, they have been arrested and they're facing now 30 years or more in prison for so-called terrorist attack or terrorist threats. And Conspiracy Granny is taken to a mental institution. She's been arrested as well. She's in jail, but she's going to be transported to mental institution for 3 months, and then she's facing about 20 years. So please go to 153news.org or .com. I'm not sure, .net maybe. That's a platform that is following this case very, very closely and is doing what they can to support them. So I just want to make you aware of that.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Kevin Barrett, your radio program, blog, website, where do people go?
You can find just about everything I do by way of my main website, which is truthjihad.com. And you can also watch False Flag Weekly News here on noliesradio.org every Friday at noon to 1 p.m. Eastern. But once again, the website where you can find that and everything else I do is truthjihad.com.
I went to add, please try to find my book, October Surprise. And there's a chapter in there on the Gladio stores being drawn down to send to Iran for the treasonous deal that defeated Jimmy Carter and put Bush Sr. in the vice presidency just before he tried to kill Reagan in the assassination attempt against Reagan. My book, October Surprise, on Amazon.
Well, thank you all very much. Viewers, we are going to take a much needed break here, but we will be back at 6 o'clock Eastern time for our next presentation, and that will be the next and last presentation of the day: Triple Blockade, the Israeli attack on Gaza, free speech and democracy. Come back and make sure you listen and see what it is that the Left Forum desperately did not want you to hear and see. Thank you all very much.
Now you know why.
Thank you all very much. Godspeed.
Godspeed.